Welcome. Tonight, we journey through the winding tales of one of mythology's most fascinating figures, Loki, the Trickster. In a world where gods commanded the skies and giants roamed the earth, there was one being who didn't follow the rules, because he understood that life was never meant to be predictable. This is not just a story of mischief or chaos. It's a story of transformation, of cleverness, resilience, and the quiet power of embracing the unexpected. So, find a comfortable place. Let your mind drift and allow the gentle flow of this ancient tale to carry you. This is the entire story of Loki. The rise, the chaos, and the fall. And perhaps something far more enduring. Now, let us begin. In the age before time moved, as it does now, before the seasons danced across the skies, and the stars held names, the realms were new, raw, and trembling with potential. From the icy chaos of Niflheim to the fiery rivers of Muspelheim, a strange harmony wove itself into existence, a balance not yet understood. And within that balance, between fire and frost, was born a being unlike any other, Loki. Neither fully divine nor completely monstrous, Loki was a puzzle carved in contradiction. The son of giants, yet the companion of gods, his name would echo across the worlds as both savior and betrayer, a force of cleverness and destruction, of laughter and sorrow. Loki's origins are as enigmatic as his actions. He was born to the giant Farboti, whose name means cruel striker, and to Lofi, a lesser-known figure whose very name whispers of leaves and hidden things. From these parents came a child not destined to remain among the Jotnar. He was clever, charming, and endlessly shifting, not content to stay in one place or wear one face. At some point in his youth, Loki found himself among the Aesir, the gods of Asgard, and there began a relationship that would shape the fate of all 9 realms. With Odin Allfather, he forged a blood pact, a brotherhood rooted not in kinship, but in deep mutual respect, or perhaps mutual usefulness. Loki was not just a god of mischief, he was its very embodiment. He could shapeshift into animals or people, man or woman, wind or fire. He twisted words into weapons and wove schemes that even the wisest could not untangle. Yet for every chaos he unleashed, he often brought unexpected blessings. He was the breaker of rules, but also their enforcer when it suited him. He was, in many ways, a necessary evil, or perhaps a misunderstood necessity. One of Loki's earliest and most telling tales begins with the building of Asgard's mighty walls. After many attacks from the Jotnar, the gods decided to fortify their realm. A mysterious builder arrived, offering to construct impenetrable walls in exchange for the hand of the goddess Freyja, along with the sun and the moon. Horrified by the price, the gods turned to Loki. With his usual flair, Loki suggested they accept the offer, but only if the builder completed the task within an impossibly short time. The builder agreed, and to everyone's dismay, began progressing at a shocking pace, aided by a powerful stallion named Svadilfari. As the deadline loomed and the gods panicked, Loki was blamed for the looming disaster. He had to fix it. So, using his magic, Loki transformed himself into a beautiful mare and lured the stallion away, distracting him long enough to prevent the walls from being completed on time. The builder, revealed to be a giant in disguise, was struck down. But Loki's deception came with consequences. Months later, He returned to Asgard not alone, but with a foal. That child was Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse, swiftest of all beings, whom Loki gifted to Odin. From sabotage came a symbol of power, a pattern that would repeat in many of Loki's stories. But Loki's most curious legacy may lie in his children. With the giantess Angrboda, he fathered three beings of terrible power. First came Fenrir, the monstrous wolf destined to kill Odin himself. Then came Jormungandr, the world serpent so vast it encircled Midgard and bit its own tail. Lastly, Hel, half beautiful and half decayed, ruler of the realm of the dead. The gods, fearing a prophecy that these offspring would bring ruin at Ragnarok, chose to act. Fenrir was chained, Jormungandr cast into the sea, and Hel banished to rule the underworld. In this, we see a darker aspect of Loki, not through what he did, but through what was born of him. His children, like him, were too powerful, too strange, to be allowed to roam free. Yet Loki did not mourn their exile. He accepted the fate that bound them, or perhaps he understood that their time would come again. He continued to walk among the gods, ever the jester, ever the trickster. He would help them when it suited him, or hinder them if it pleased him more. Sometimes his tricks brought joy, other times pain, but always, they revealed truth. In every tale, Loki stripped away illusion, even if it hurt. He was the mirror no one wished to gaze into, but all were forced to. A perfect example of his dual nature is the tale of Sif's golden hair. One night, as a joke, Loki snuck into the bedchamber of Thor's wife, Sif, and cut off all her golden hair. When Thor awoke and found his wife weeping, he grabbed Loki by the throat and threatened to break every bone in his body. Loki, ever the survivor, pleaded for mercy and promised to fix what he had done. He traveled to the realm of the dwarves, master craftsmen of legend, and asked them to forge a new head of hair for Sif, spun from real gold that would grow like the hair she lost. But Loki, being Loki, he couldn't help but stir the pot further. He provoked another group of dwarves to outdo the first, betting his own head on their craftsmanship. From this wager came not just Sif's hair, but the spear Gungnir for Odin, the ship Skidbladnir for Freyr, and the mighty hammer Mjolnir for Thor. And while Loki tried to cheat the dwarves out of their prize, he narrowly escaped with his life, his lips sewn shut as punishment for his deceit. Still, the gods kept their treasures. The fruits of mischief turned miracle. Time and again, Loki proved that chaos could be a crucible from which greatness emerged. Yet the gods never truly trusted him. He remained the outsider, the guest whose welcome wore thin, the flame that warmed but also burned. His laughter could lift spirits, or it could echo through the halls like a curse. His friendship was real, but also conditional, shaped by whims and unseen motives. Odin, wise beyond words, kept Loki close not because he trusted him, but because he knew the storm is best watched from within. Though Loki often brought gifts through his mischief, there was always an undertone of danger in his actions, a reminder that his loyalty was as shifting as his form. The gods of Asgard knew this well, but they tolerated him, for his cleverness was unmatched, and his schemes often saved them when brute strength could not. Yet beneath every jest and every sly smile, there brewed something deeper, a resentment perhaps, or a knowledge that he would never truly belong among them. He was a guest at their table, but never a brother in their hearts. As years passed, Loki's antics became more unpredictable, sometimes helpful, sometimes cruel. One such tale unfolded when the gods lost one of their most prized possessions. Mjolnir, Thor's mighty hammer, had vanished. Without it, Asgard stood vulnerable. It didn't take long for Loki to discover that the hammer had been stolen by Thrym, a greedy giant who demanded Freyja's hand in marriage in exchange for its return. The gods were furious, but powerless without the weapon. Once again, they turned to Loki for a solution. With a glint in his eye, Loki devised a plan as bold as it was absurd. He suggested that Thor disguise himself as Freya and go to Jotunheim to retrieve the hammer. Thor, ever prideful, resisted the idea, but with no other choice, he agreed. Loki, of course, joined him, this time taking the form of a handmaiden to complete the deception. Wrapped in bridal veils and adorned with jewels, Thor and Loki journeyed to the land of giants. Upon arrival, Thrym welcomed his bride with feasts and celebration. But the giant grew suspicious when Thor, unable to contain his appetite, devoured entire animals and drank barrels of mead in a single sitting. Loki, quick with words, explained that Freya had fasted out of excitement for her wedding. The ruse held long enough for Thrym to bring forth Mjolnir to bless the union. The moment the hammer touched Thor's hands, he cast aside his disguise and unleashed his fury, striking down Thrym and every giant present. Loki, as always, stood by with a smirk, having orchestrated the entire spectacle. This tale, like many others, showed how Loki danced on the edge between salvation and ruin, how he could mock the gods even while rescuing them. But each trick, each deception, added weight to the growing distrust in Asgard. For all his cunning, Loki's place among the gods was becoming ever more fragile. Yet, even as tension simmered, Loki continued to weave himself into every corner of Asgardian life. His relationships were tangled webs. None more tragic than his bond with Balder, the beloved son of Odin and Frigg. Balder was the shining light of Asgard, adored by all for his beauty, kindness, and wisdom. But Balder was plagued by dreams of his own death, and Frigg, desperate to protect him, made every living thing, every object in the world, swear never to harm her son. Everything, except one seemingly harmless thing, mistletoe. When Loki learned of this, a dark curiosity took hold. The gods had turned Balder's invulnerability into a game, throwing weapons at him for sport, laughing as nothing could wound him. Loki, always seeking to test boundaries, crafted a dart from mistletoe. Approaching Hoder, Balder's blind brother, Loki offered to guide his hand so he too could join in the game. Unaware of the trick, Hoder launched the dart, and to the horror of all, it pierced Balder's heart. The shining god fell lifeless, and silence swept over Asgard. Grief consumed the gods, but it was too late. Balder had descended to Hel's realm. Still, hope lingered. Frigg pleaded for someone to journey to the underworld and bargain for her son's return. Hermod, another son of Odin, rode Sleipnir through the shadowed paths to Hel's domain. There, Hel offered a cruel bargain. If every creature in the world wept for Balder, he would be allowed to return. And so, the gods sent word across all realms, and indeed, every being shed tears for the fallen god. Every being but one. An old giantess named Thok refused to weep, claiming Balder meant nothing to her, but the gods suspected the truth. That Thok was Loki in disguise, sealing Balder's fate out of spite or some deeper, unknowable motive. With that final act, Loki crossed a line from which there was no return. The gods could no longer ignore the threat he posed. They hunted Loki, who fled Asgard, seeking refuge in the remote mountains. There, he built a house with 4 doors, always watching in every direction. By day, he took the form of a salmon, hiding in the rivers, slipping through the currents with the same ease he had slipped through the gods' trust for so long. But fate, like a net, was closing in. The gods crafted a fishing net to catch him, learning from Loki's own inventions. When they cast it into the waters, Loki leapt to escape, but Thor's hand was swift. He caught the slippery trickster mid-air, dragging him back to face judgment. What followed was not a trial, but a sentence. The gods, furious and grieving, bound Loki with the entrails of his son, forcing him into a cave deep beneath the earth. Above him, they placed a serpent whose venom dripped endlessly onto his face. His wife, Sigyn, remained by his side, catching the poison in a bowl, but whenever she emptied it, drops would strike Loki's brow, sending him into writhing agony. It was said that his convulsions caused earthquakes in Midgard. And so, Loki remained, bound, humiliated, and seething with rage, waiting for the day when his chains would break, when the world would tremble, and when his role in the final act of fate would begin. Bound beneath the earth, Loki's mind became a storm of memories, regrets, and simmering vengeance. The drip of venom marked the passage of time in cruel rhythm, each drop a reminder of betrayal, of friendships turned sour, of laughter that once echoed through Asgard, now replaced by silence and scorn. Yet even in chains, Loki's spirit was unbroken. His thoughts wandered to the promises whispered in ancient prophecies of a day when the skies would darken, when the roots of Yggdrasil would tremble, and when he would walk free once more. That day was known to the gods as Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, a fate they feared but could not escape, and central to that destiny was Lokite Trickster turned harbinger of doom. It was foretold that when the final winter came, when the bonds of the world weakened, Loki would break his chains and lead an army against those he once called kin. His children Fenrir, Jormungandr, and Hel would rise in defiance of the cosmic order, each playing their part in the unraveling of existence. But before that distant storm, there was the quiet, the long years where Loki's name became a bitter memory among the Aesir. Stories of his past deeds lingered in Asgard, told in hushed tones. Some still marveled at his cunning, while others cursed his name. Yet none could deny that Loki had been woven into every chapter of their history. He had given them treasures beyond imagining, saved them from ruin more than once, and yet, with equal measure, he had doomed them with his betrayals. In the mortal realm of Midgard too, tales of Loki drifted like autumnly vestries of a god who could not be tamed, who defied authority and laughed in the face of power. Among humans, some saw him not as a villain, but as a symbol of rebellion, a force that challenged the arrogance of gods. For mortals who lived under the weight of fate and the whims of higher beings, Loki's defiance was almost admirable. He was proof that even among immortals, there existed a voice that refused to bow. Deep within his cavern prison, Loki's thoughts often returned to Odin. The Allfather, wise beyond comprehension, had once called him brother. Their bond had been forged not by blood, but by choice, a rare thing among gods and giants alike. Yet that bond had shattered beneath the weight of mistrust and prophecy. Odin, with all his foresight, must have known that bringing Loki into Asgard was a gamble, that chaos cannot be caged without consequence. Perhaps Odin had hoped to temper Loki's nature, to guide it toward order, but such hopes were as fleeting as smoke. Then there was Thor, the Thunderer, the hammer wielder, the embodiment of strength and simplicity. Loki had mocked him endlessly, tricked him more times than could be counted, yet beneath the jesting was a strange form of respect. Thor represented everything Loki was not straightforward, honorable in his own brash way, a protector without guile. Their rivalry had been a game at first, but like all games, it had turned serious when lines were crossed and blood was spilled. And what of Sigyn, his faithful wife? Among all the beings in the 9 realms, she alone had remained by Loki's side in his darkest hour. With unwavering devotion, she held the bowl to catch the serpent's venom, sparing him endless pain. Her loyalty was a quiet defiance against the gods' judgment, a reminder that even the most reviled soul could be loved. Loki often wondered what the gods thought as they looked upon Sigyn's sacrifice. Did they see it as foolishness, or did it gnaw at their sense of justice? The years stretched on, but time is a strange thing to a god. While mortals lived and died, kingdoms rose and fell, Loki waited. And as he waited, the signs began to stir. Fimbulwinter, the great, unending winter, crept across Midgard. Crops failed, families starved, and brother turned against brother in desperation. The balance of the world began to tilt, and with every crack in that balance, Loki felt his bonds weaken. When at last the day arrived, it was not with fanfare or triumph, but with the groaning of stone and the snapping of ancient chains. The serpent above him hissed and recoiled as Loki stood, free once more. His eyes, gleaming with a mixture of fury and grim purpose, turned toward the distant echoes of Yggdrasil's trembling roots. He knew what must come next. There was no turning back. Not for him, nor for the gods. Summoning the ships of the dead, Loki sailed Naglfarth, a vessel crafted from the nails of the deceased across the flooded plains. At his side marched legions of giants and the damned, ready to bring about the end foretold since the dawn of creation. Fenrir, his mighty son, roared as he broke free from his fetters, his jaws opening wide enough to swallow the sun itself. Jormungandr stirred in the depths, rising to coil around Midgard, poisoning the skies with his breath. The final battle had begun, not out of malice alone, but as a fulfillment of destiny. For in the Norse understanding of the world, endings were not tragedies, but necessary cycles. Death made way for rebirth. Destruction cleared the path for creation. Loki, more than any other, embodied this truth. He was not merely the architect of chaos. He was the catalyst for change. As the forces of chaos clashed with the gods on the fields of Vigrid, Loki faced Heimdall, the watchman of Asgard, whose keen eyes had long anticipated this confrontation. The two were destined to slay each other, a final act of balance between order and disorder. Steel met steel, and amidst the roar of battle and the cracking of worlds, Loki met his fate with a twisted smile upon his lips, a smile that spoke not of defeat, but of inevitability. But Ragnarok was not the end, only a turning of the page in the saga of existence. From the ashes of fallen gods and shattered realms, a new world would rise greener, purer, free from the shadows of the past. And though Loki's body lay broken, his essence, his legacy, would linger in every whisper of wind, every flicker of flame, reminding all who came after that there is power in questioning, in challenging, in embracing the unknown. In the silence that followed Ragnarok, when the roar of battle faded and the smoke of burning realms drifted away into nothingness. The memory of Loki did not vanish with the fallen gods. It lingered, not as a shadow of evil, but as a complex echo of everything he had been. For Loki was never simply a villain, nor merely a trickster. He was a reflection of the chaos woven into the very fabric of existence. Where there was order, he was the question mark. Where there was certainty, he was the whisper of doubt. Those who survived the end few, as they spoke of the world reborn, a land where rivers ran clear, where the skies gleamed without the stain of smoke, where life began anew. Yet even in this fresh beginning, the stories of old were told once more. Around new fires, beneath the vast branches of a renewed Yggdrasil, mortals and gods alike remembered the figure who had shaped so much of what came before. Loki's name was spoken not just with fear, but with a strange sense of wonder. For how does one define a being like Loki? He was the breaker of boundaries, the challenger of fate, the spark that ignited both ruin and renewal. Without him, the gods would have remained complacent, blind to their own fragility. It was Loki who forced them to confront the consequences of their arrogance, who reminded them that even immortals could bleed, could falter, could fall. In a world governed by fate, where destinies were carved long before birth, Loki stood as a rare force of unpredictability, a living defiance against the straight path. The tales of his youth, before bitterness took root, painted a picture of a god who delighted in cleverness for its own sake. Loki, who could talk his way out of any danger, who could turn enemies into allies with a single twist of words, who could weave magic not just through spells, but through stories and illusions. He was laughter in the halls of Asgard, a companion on dangerous quests, a mind as sharp as any blade. There were times when even Thor, so often the butt of Loki's jokes, could not help but grin at his companion's antics. Yet it was this very brilliance that made Loki dangerous. He saw the cracks in the foundation of the god's world, and once seen, he could not ignore them. While others worshipped strength and tradition, Loki valued wit, change, and the thrill of testing limits. To him, rules were invitations to be broken. Walls were meant to be climbed over or torn down. It was not malice that drove him at first, but an insatiable curiosity, a need to see what lay beyond the edges of order. But curiosity can become resentment when met with constant suspicion. Loki, though welcomed into Asgard, was never fully trusted. He was the outsider, the adopted ally whose presence was tolerated but never fully embraced. Every glance cast his way was tinged with doubt, every praise followed by caution. Over time, such treatment sowed seeds of bitterness. The playful trickster began to sharpen his mischief into something darker. Not just playful pranks, but pointed lessons meant to expose the hypocrisy and fragility of the gods. Even so, there were moments when Loki's actions were driven by something more than self-interest. When Asgard faced threats from beyond its borders, it was often Loki's ingenuity that saved the day. Whether tricking giants, outwitting monsters, or crafting solutions where brute force would fail, Loki proved time and again that chaos could be a tool for survival. Yet, each victory was met not with gratitude, but with wary glances, as if every favor he granted carried a hidden price. And perhaps it did, for Loki understood better than anyone that nothing in the cosmos was truly free. Every action rippled outward, every choice carried weight. If the gods chose to ignore the consequences of their deeds, Loki would ensure they were reminded. This was the heart of his nature knot. evil for its own sake, but a relentless unveiling of truth, no matter how uncomfortable. The tragedy of Loki lies not in his fall from grace, but in the inevitability of that fall. From the moment he stepped into Asgard, his path was set. Not by fate alone, but by the rigid structures of a world that could not tolerate what he represented. Change, after all, is a threat to those who build their power on permanence. Loki was the storm that exposed the rot beneath the gold, the flickering flame that revealed the shadows lurking behind the light. Yet even as he marched toward Ragnarok, leading armies against the very gods he once dined with, there was a sense that Loki was fulfilling a role assigned to him long before his first trick was played. He became the villain because the world needed one, because in a cosmos obsessed with balance, someone had to bear the weight of chaos. And if that burden fell upon his shoulders, he would carry it with the same sly grin he had worn since the beginning. After the fires of Ragnarok cooled and the world began anew, some say that Loki's spirit did not fade entirely, for how can chaos ever truly be extinguished? In every act of rebellion, in every question asked against authority, in every laugh shared in the face of despair, there Loki lived on. Not as a god to be worshipped, nor as a demon to be feared, but as a reminder that the world is not meant to stand still. The new gods, born from the survivors of the old, would tell stories of the past to warn or to teach. And in those stories, Loki was not simply cast as the destroyer, but as the necessary force that cleared the path for rebirth. Without his fire, the old ways would have calcified into tyranny. Without his tricks, the gods would have forgotten humility. Without his chaos, there could be no true order. Thus, the tale of Loki is not one of simple rise and fall, but of cycles, of beginnings hidden within endings, of a spark that flickers eternal in the heart of existence. And though his laughter may no longer echo through the halls of Asgard, it lingers in the wind, a soft, knowing whisper that promises, wherever there is certainty, he will be there to unravel it. Long after the dust of Ragnarok settled and new life stirred beneath the renewed sky, the essence of Loki became something more than memory. His story wove itself into the very soul of those who listened. A tale not merely of a trickster, but of the eternal dance between order and chaos. Across the lands of mortals, skalds and storytellers kept his name alive, not as a warning alone, but as a symbol of the unpredictable current that runs beneath all things. For every kingdom that rose in perfect symmetry, there would come a moment when cracks appeared, when traditions were questioned, when the winds of change whispered through stone halls. And in those moments, it was said that Loki's spirit stirred, unseen, but felt, not to bring ruin for ruin's sake, but to remind the world that stagnation is the true enemy of life. Where others feared disorder, Loki embraced it as a catalyst, a force that burned away falsehoods to reveal what lay beneath. Among the gods who survived the old world, the memory of Loki remained complicated. Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, along with Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor, inherited a realm cleansed by fire but haunted by echoes. They rebuilt Asgard with lessons carved deep into their hearts, wary now of letting any one force grow too powerful, too rigid. And though they did not speak Loki's name with reverence, neither did they erase him from their histories. For even they understood that without his hand tipping the scales, the balance they now cherished would never have been restored. In hidden corners of Midgard, where the forests grew thick and the rivers sang ancient songs. There were those who still whispered prayers not to plead for protection, but to invoke courage, to call upon the spirit of the one who defied fate itself. Travelers facing uncertain roads, outcasts forging their own paths, thinkers who dared to question sacred truths. They found a strange kinship with the old tales of Loki. To them, he was not a villain, but a reminder that the world's edges were meant to be explored, its rules meant to be tested. And so, the story of Loki endured not as a tale of simple mischief, nor as a chronicle of evil, but as a reflection of life's most untamable force. He was the laughter that broke tension in the darkest moments, the clever word that unraveled a tyrant's decree, the spark of rebellion in a heart that refused to bow. His presence was not bound to temples or rituals, but lived in every act of daring, every challenge to the status quo. There were, of course, those who feared this legacy. Kings and priests, rulers who built their power upon unchanging laws, cursed the name of Loki as a corrupter, a seducer of minds who led people away from obedience. To them, he was a dangerous memory, a force best forgotten lest it inspire disobedience. But even their efforts to suppress his story only fed the flame. For the more they tried to silence his name, the louder it echoed in the hearts of those who longed for freedom. In dreams, some said, Loki still wandered, not in the form of a god, but as a flickering presence, sometimes a fox darting through the woods, sometimes a breeze that carried strange laughter, sometimes a stranger at the crossroads offering riddles instead of directions. Those who met him in such visions often woke with a sense of unease, but also with clarity, as if they had glimpsed a truth too wild to grasp fully. The cycles of the world continued, as they always do. Empires rose and fell, gods were worshipped and forgotten, but the essence of chaos remained eternal, and with it, so did Loki's spirit. For as long as being sought certainty, there would always be a need for the one who asked, "What if everything you believe is only a fragile illusion?" In the quiet moments before sleep, when the mind drifts beyond the walls of daily thought, the story of Loki lingers, not to disturb, but to awaken a deeper understanding. That life, in all its beauty and terror, thrives in the unknown. That order without challenge grows brittle. And that sometimes it takes a trickster's hand to remind the world how to dance with uncertainty. Thus, Loki's tale is not truly a story of rise and fall, but of transformation, from a child of giants to a guest among gods, from a jester to a catalyst of fate, from a bound prisoner to a force that transcended even death. His journey was never about victory or defeat, but about embodying the truth that change is the heartbeat of existence. And so, as the stars wheel across the night sky and the winds carry whispers through the trees, somewhere, faint but eternal, echoes the soft, knowing laughter of Loki, a reminder that even in the most ordered of worlds, chaos waits patiently, smiling. Before the world reached its breaking point, before chains bound him beneath the earth, Loki's path was a winding one, filled with moments where he stood not as an enemy of the gods, but as their most cunning ally. It is easy to remember his fall, to recall the bitterness and betrayal, but there was a time when Loki's presence in Asgard was welcomed even if it was laced with caution. His cleverness was not just tolerated, it was sought after when the gods found themselves trapped by problems beyond the reach of strength or honor. There was a tale, half forgotten by the time Ragnarok arrived, that spoke of such a moment, a time when Loki's wit saved the gods from a fate they could not have foreseen. It began when Odin, always in pursuit of knowledge, ventured too far into realms where even he was a stranger. In his thirst for secrets, Odin uncovered whispers of a hidden power buried deep within the roots of Yggdrasil, a force that could either protect the realms or unravel them entirely. But to claim this power, a riddle older than the gods themselves needed to be solved, stone that no force of arms could conquer. Upon Odin's return to Asgard, troubled by the enigma, it was Loki whom he summoned. Not because he trusted him, but because he knew that if anyone could untangle the threads of ancient mysteries, it was the Trickster. Loki listened, his sharp eyes gleaming with interest, not out of loyalty, but out of the irresistible pull of a puzzle worthy of his mind. To solve a riddle that confounded even the Allfather was a challenge too tempting to ignore. With his usual flair, Loki embarked on a journey across realms, seeking fragments of forgotten lore, striking bargains with beings long thought lost to time. He danced with words in the courts of elves, outwitted the dwarves in their deep forges, and even conversed with shadows that slithered between the roots of the world tree. Each answer he gathered was like a piece of a shattered mirror, reflecting glimpses of a truth too vast for any one being to hold. When at last he returned to Asgard, it was with the solution cradled in riddles of his own making. He presented Odin not with a weapon, nor with a spell, but with a simple truth: that some powers are best left untouched, that the desire to control what lies beyond understanding is a folly even gods should fear. Odin, wise enough to recognize wisdom when cloaked in mischief, heeded Loki's counsel, and so a disaster was averted not by valor, but by the cunning of the one they would later cast out. Stories like this faded over time, overshadowed by Loki's eventual betrayals, yet they remained, hidden in the corners of old songs and carved faintly into stones that few remembered how to read. They told of a god who did not fit neatly into the roles others expected, who could save the day with the same hand that would later strike the fatal blow. It was this duality that made Loki so dangerous and so fascinating. The gods, for all their might, lived by rules and oaths, bound by honor and destiny. Loki lived by none of these. His freedom was absolute, and with that freedom came unpredictability. He was a reminder that not all power comes from strength, that the mind, when sharpened by wit and unchained by convention, could rival the mightiest hammer or spear. But such freedom came at a cost. Asgard was a realm of order, and Loki's very nature was a disruption of that order. Each time he bent the rules, each time he revealed uncomfortable truths, he pulled further away from those who once called him friend. What began as playful mischief slowly transformed into something darker, not because Loki changed, but because the world around him could no longer tolerate what he represented. As the years wove their tapestry of alliances, betrayals, and uneasy truces, Loki must have known where his path would lead. Perhaps he even welcomed it. There is a certain power in embracing the role others fear you will become. When every glance is laced with suspicion, when every deed is doubted, the line between jest and vengeance begins to blur. Yet for all his schemes, for all the chaos he sowed, Loki never acted without purpose. His tricks were rarely meaningless. Behind every jest was a lesson. Behind every betrayal, a reflection of the gods' own flaws. He was the mirror they wished to shatter, the voice they tried to silence, because it spoke truths too sharp to bear. And so, as fate drew ever closer to its inevitable crescendo, Loki remained true to himself, not as a hero, nor as a villain, but as a force that refused to be caged by the expectations of gods or mortals. His rise was not marked by conquest or dominion, but by the simple, profound act of being the question in a world obsessed with answers. There was a time when even the gods marveled at Loki's brilliance, when his clever words and daring ideas were not met with suspicion, but with admiration. In those earlier days, before mistrust hardened into resentment, Loki walked freely through the golden halls of Asgard, a welcomed guest at feasts, a companion in council, a voice that could break tension with a jest, or offer solutions where none seemed possible. It is easy to forget that before he was the harbinger of chaos, Loki was often the savior of gods. One such story tells of the day when Asgard faced a threat not from giants or monsters, but from within, when greed and pride among the gods themselves nearly led to ruin. The tale begins with Odin's desire to possess every secret, every piece of wisdom the realms could offer. In his endless pursuit, he learned of a mead. Not just any mead, but one that granted poetic inspiration and boundless knowledge to those who drank it. This was the mead of poetry, crafted from the blood of a wise being and guarded jealously by a giant named Suttung. Odin, determined to claim it for himself and the gods, devised a plan, but even his cunning had limits when dealing with giants wary of his tricks. It was Loki who offered a more intricate solution that required patience, deception, and a touch of audacity only he could provide. Disguises were donned, lies were spun into silk, and together Odin and Loki weaved a plot to infiltrate Suttung's domain. Loki's role was pivotal. He distracted Suttung's kin, sowed confusion among the giant servants, and ensured that Odin could slip through unseen. When the Allfather finally seized the mead and transformed into an eagle to escape, it was Loki who had prepared the path, clearing obstacles that would have doomed the plan. The gods would later sing praises of Odin's daring theft, but few acknowledged that without Loki's hand, the mead of poetry would never have graced Asgard's halls. These were the moments that defined the complexity of Loki's place among the gods. Time after time, he proved that his mind was a weapon as sharp as any blade wielded by Thor, that his ability to see the world sideways, to approach problems from angles no one else considered, made him invaluable. Yet with every victory came unease. For if Loki could deceive their enemies so easily, what would stop him from turning that same skill inward against those who sat beside him at the feasting table? This question lingered like a shadow, growing darker with each passing age. The gods, bound by their codes and traditions, could not comprehend a being who answered to none but himself. And so, they began to watch him more closely, their laughter at his jokes a little more forced, their gratitude for his help tinged with fear. Loki, perceptive as ever, noticed the shift. He saw the walls rising around him not of stone, but of doubt and expectation. It is said that the weight of being misunderstood can twist even the lightest heart. Whether Loki's descent into darker schemes was driven by bitterness or by the simple realization that he could never be anything but the outsider is a matter of debate among those who tell his tale. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps Loki, in seeing that he would always be blamed for chaos, chose to wield it fully, to become the storm, rather than be swept away by it. Yet, despite this growing divide, there remained moments of strange, fleeting camaraderie. Loki still stood beside Thor on countless adventures, crossing realms to recover stolen treasures, or to outwit foes too clever for brute strength alone. Their partnership, though fraught with tension, endured longer than any might have expected. Thor, in his straightforwardness, often found himself tangled in problems only Loki could unravel. And for reasons even Loki might not have fully understood, he continued to help, at least for a time. One such adventure led them to the land of the giants once more, when Thor's hammer was stolen not by force, but through cunning. Thrym, a giant lord, demanded Freya's hand in marriage as ransom for Mjolnir. It was Loki who crafted the absurd plan to disguise Thor as a bride, knowing full well the humiliation it would bring. Yet beneath the mockery was a lesson that sometimes pride must be swallowed to reclaim power. Thor, begrudgingly donning the bridal veil, played his part, and when Mjolnir was finally placed in his hands, it was Loki's laughter that rang loudest as the giants fell beneath the hammer's fury. These tales, scattered like fragments of a broken mirror, show a different side of Lokione, where his chaos served as a shield, where his mischief protected those who could not see beyond the immediate threat. But with each passing triumph, the rift between Loki and the gods widened. The more they relied on his cunning, the more they feared its potential to turn against them. And so, the stage was set long before Baldur's death, long before the venom dripped upon his brow. The seeds of discord were planted not by a single act of betrayal, but by years of mistrust, by the slow erosion of bonds that were never allowed to truly take root. Loki's rise was not meteoric, nor was his fall sudden. It was a gradual unfolding, a path walked step by step, each footfall echoing with the knowledge that the world he had helped to shape would one day cast him out. As the years in Asgard stretched on, Loki's role became increasingly ambiguous. No longer just the clever companion, but something far more unsettling, a reminder that beneath every golden hall and shining feast, cracks in the foundation were beginning to spread. The gods, in all their power and wisdom, could sense it. A subtle shifting of balance, a feeling that the world they had built was resting upon fragile truths. And at the center of this uneasy awareness stood Loki, the one who had always thrived in the spaces between certainty and doubt. It was during this time that Loki's mischief took on a sharper edge. No longer content with simple pranks or clever solutions, he began to expose the vulnerabilities of the gods in ways that were harder to laugh off. One such moment occurred during a grand feast in Asgard, a gathering where gods and goddesses celebrated their triumphs, raising horns of mead in honor of their deeds. The hall was filled with light and song, but as always, beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Loki, never one to let pride go unchecked, chose this night to speak truths no one wished to hear. Rising from his seat, he began to hurl insults, not wild accusations, but carefully chosen words that struck at the heart of each god's insecurities. He mocked Odin's endless quest for knowledge, questioning whether wisdom gained at such great cost had truly made him better. He taunted Freyja for her vanity and accused her of consorting with those she deemed beneath her. Even Thor was not spared, with Loki ridiculing his reliance on brute strength and calling him a pawn of fate. This was no ordinary jest. It was a deliberate unraveling of the masks each god wore, a stripping away of the illusions they clung to. The feast grew silent as Loki's words cut deeper, exposing secrets and shames that had long been buried beneath divine arrogance. Some gods reached for their weapons, others for their pride, but none could deny the truths laced within Loki's venomous speech. When at last he finished, the hall was heavy with a silence more deafening than any roar of battle. Loki, knowing he had crossed yet another invisible line, left the feast not with a triumphant smirk, but with a look of quiet defiance. He had held up a mirror to the gods, and they had recoiled at their own reflections. It was after this night that the whispers began to grow louder. No longer was Loki merely tolerated. He was watched, distrusted, and slowly pushed to the edges of Asgardian society. The gods, unwilling to face the discomfort he brought, began to speak of him as if he were already an enemy, and in doing so, they pushed him further toward that destiny. Yet, even as his standing among the gods crumbled, Loki found solace in unexpected places. His bond with his children, though strained by the cruel fates imposed upon them, remained a tether to something genuine. He thought often of Fenrir, bound by fear rather than justice, of Jormungandr, cast into the depths simply for existing, and of Hel, ruling over the dead in a realm of shadows. In them, Loki saw the reflection of his own Exilia family, deemed too dangerous to be allowed freedom, punished not for their deeds, but for what they might become. There were moments when Loki would wander to the edges of realms, standing at the borders between worlds, gazing into the vast unknown. It was here, away from the judging eyes of gods, that he could breathe freely, where the weight of expectation fell away, and he could simply exist as he was fluid, untamed, unbound by the rigid lines others tried to draw around him. But fate, ever watchful, continued its slow march toward the inevitable. The gods could sense that a reckoning loomed, though they dared not speak its name. Prophecies whispered of Ragnarok, of a day when the skies would split and the seas would rise, when old grudges would ignite into war. And always, at the heart of these visions, was Loki, leading the charge not out of sheer malice, but because the world had left him no other place to stand. It is said that in his final days before his capture, Loki's laughter became quieter, less of a playful melody, and more of a knowing murmur. He no longer needed grand tricks or elaborate schemes to unsettle the gods. His very presence was enough a living reminder that chaos was not something that could be locked away or forgotten. It lived in every unspoken fear, every crack in the armor of pride. When the gods at last moved against him, it was not with the righteousness of justice, but with the desperation of those who feared what they could not control. Loki fled, as they knew he would, weaving through realms, slipping through forms, always a step ahead. But even he knew that this chase had only one ending. No trick could outrun destiny forever. And so, when Thor's hand finally closed around him, dragging him from the river's depths, Loki did not struggle. He faced his captors with a calm that unnerved them more than any taunt could. For Loki understood what they did, not that his binding was not the end, but merely a pause, a gathering of storms yet to come. When the gods dragged Loki to his fate, it was not in triumph, but in silence, a heavy, uneasy quiet that settled over them like a fog. There was no celebration in capturing the trickster, no song sung of victory, for even in chains, Loki's presence carried a weight they could not ignore. He walked among them not as a defeated enemy, but as one who understood the deeper currents of fate currents that even the gods were powerless to resist. The place chosen for his punishment was deep beneath the surface of Midgard, far from the light of sun or moon, where the roots of Yggdrasil coiled in ancient darkness. There, the gods performed a cruel ritual, binding Loki with the entrails of his own sown act, designed not just to restrain his body, but to break his spirit. Above him, they fastened a serpent whose venom dripped steadily onto his face, a slow and endless torture meant to remind him of his transgressions. Yet even in this moment of supposed defeat, Loki remained defiant. His wife, Sigyn, knelt beside him, holding a bowl to catch the venom, her quiet devotion a stark contrast to the god's harsh judgment. Whenever the bowl filled and she turned to empty it, drops of venom would strike Loki's brow, sending him into convulsions that shook the earth itself. But through it all, he endured not with pleas for mercy, but with the same knowing glint in his eyes that had unsettled the gods since the beginning. Time in that cavern was meaningless. Days and nights held no sway in the darkness. For mortals, generations would pass. Kingdoms would rise and fall. Yet Loki remained, bound but not broken, waiting. The gods believed they had secured their safety, that with Loki imprisoned, the threat of chaos had been contained. But deep within, they must have known the truth that chaos is not so easily chained, and that fate does not forget. While Loki lay beneath the earth, the signs of coming doom began to stir across the realms. Fimbulwinter crept upon Midgard, a bitter cold that would not thaw. Brothers turned against brothers, and the bonds of kinship frayed beneath the weight of despair. In Asgard, the gods grew restless, their once celebrated feasts now shadowed by the knowledge that the end approached. Not because of Loki alone, but because the world itself moved in cycles, and no amount of power could halt its turning. In his solitude, Loki's thoughts often wandered not to revenge, but to reflection. He thought of the paths he had walked, of the choices that led him here. Did he regret them? Perhaps. Or perhaps he understood that regret was a luxury for those who believed they could change the past. Loki, more than anyone, knew that the past was but a prelude to what must come. His mind, sharp as ever, traced the threads of fate, knowing that every drop of venom was merely a reminder that his role was not yet finished. Far above, in realms that had all but forgotten the laughter that once echoed through Asgard's halls, the stories of Loki faded into legend. Mortals spoke of him in hushed tones, painting him as a villain, a cautionary tale of what happens to those who defy the gods. But there were others, those who saw deeper, who remembered that Loki was not born of malice, but of necessity. That his chaos had revealed truths the gods wished to bury, and that his exile was not justice, but fear disguised as order. When the final bonds began to loosen, it was not with a roar, but with a whisper like the first breath of wind before a storm. The serpent above him recoiled, sensing the shift, and the rocks that held Loki's chains trembled as if recognizing that their task was done. Sigyn, ever faithful, watched as her husband rose not with fury, but with calm purpose. The time of waiting was over. The world had reached its breaking point, and the cycle foretold in countless prophecies was ready to unfold. Loki did not need to summon his allies, they were already moving. Fenrir's chains shattered beneath his growing strength, and the great wolf's howl split the skies, announcing that the old order was crumbling. Jormungandr stirred from the depths, his massive coils sending waves crashing across the shores of Midgard. In Hel's realm, the dead marched, silent and unyielding, following the call that echoed through every corner of existence. As Loki stepped onto Naglfar, the ship crafted from the nails of the dead, he gazed upon the horizon not with hatred, but with the clarity of one who understands his place in the grand design. This was not vengeance. This was fulfillment. The gods had written this ending long before his first trick was played, long before mistrust poisoned their hearts. Now he would simply see it through. The seas boiled as Naglfar sailed toward Vigrid, the battlefield where fate would be decided. The gods, armed and resolute, awaited him not as former companions, but as adversaries locked in a dance neither could escape. Odin, with his ravens circling above, knew that his wisdom had only delayed the inevitable. Thor, gripping Mjolnir, felt the weight of prophecy heavy upon his shoulders. Each god stood ready, knowing that this was not a battle they could win, but one they were bound to fight. And amidst it all, Loki smiled not out of joy, but out of understanding. For in this final confrontation, he was not merely the trickster. He was the embodiment of the truth that all things must end so they may begin again. The field of Vigrid stretched endlessly beneath a darkened sky, a place where the threads of fate converged, where gods, giants, beasts, and the dead would clash in a final reckoning. It was here that Loki, once a guest at Asgard's feasts and a companion in divine halls, now stood as the leader of forces destined to unmake the world. Yet, as he looked across the battlefield, seeing the familiar faces of those he had once called kin, there was no hatred in his gaze, only acceptance of the role he had long been cast to play. Odin, cloaked in wisdom and burdened by the weight of countless ages, rode forth on Sleipnir, his eight-legged steed ironically, the very offspring of Loki himself. The All-Father's one eye met Loki's, and in that silent exchange, there was understanding. They had walked this path together from the beginning, bound not just by oaths and blood, but by the inevitability of this moment. Odin knew that even his sacrifices for knowledge could not alter what was to come. Elsewhere, Thor prepared to face Jormungandr, the world's serpent, knowing that their battle would shake the very foundations of Midgard. Fenrir, jaws wide enough to devour the sky, stalked toward Odin, while the legions of the dead marched against the shining host of the Aesir and the Vanir. The air itself trembled under the weight of destiny fulfilled. Loki's steps across the battlefield were steady, purposeful. He did not charge with reckless fury, nor did he command with shouts. His army moved like a tide, relentless and inevitable, answering not to orders, but to the call of the end itself. And as he advanced, he sought out the one who had watched him longer than any other, Heimdall, the ever-vigilant guardian of Bifrost, whose piercing gaze had always seen beyond illusions. It was foretold that Loki and Heimdall would meet in this final hour, not as mere adversaries, but as reflections of opposing forces, chaos and order, unpredictability and vigilance. When their eyes met across the field, there was no need for words. Both knew that their fates were intertwined, that neither would leave Vigrid standing. Steel clashed against steel as they met in battle, each strike resonating like thunder across the plains. Heimdall, with his unwavering focus, countered every feint, every trick that Loki attempted. Yet Loki, with his fluidity and cunning, slipped through defenses, turning certainty into doubt with every movement. It was not a battle of brute strength alone, but of wits, patience, and inevitability. As the duel raged, the greater battle unfolded around them. Thor and Jormungandr locked in a struggle that churned the seas and split the skies with lightning and poison. Odin faced Fenrir with grim resolve, knowing that his end lay between the wolf's massive jaws. One by one, gods and giants fell, their stories coming to a close beneath the weight of fate. Loki and Heimdall fought until neither could stand, their final blows striking true in unison. As life ebbed from their forms, Loki's lips curled into a faint smile, not of triumph, but of peace. He had never sought to survive this battle. His purpose had been to bring about the necessary end, to clear the path for what would come after. And so, as the battlefield grew quiet and the last echoes of war faded into the void, the world itself began to unravel. The sun was swallowed, the stars fell from the heavens, and the roots of Yggdrasil groaned as they released their hold on the old order. But in this destruction, there was no despair, only the promise of renewal. For the Norse knew that Ragnarok was not a tale of doom, but of cleansing. From the ashes of gods and monsters alike, a new world would rise green and pure, untouched by the pride and folly that had led to its predecessor's fall. Survivors, both mortal and divine, would emerge to begin anew, carrying with them the lessons of what had been lost. Among these survivors were Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, who would rebuild the halls of Asgard. Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor, would inherit Mjolnir, carrying forward the legacy of their father's strength. A new sun would rise, born from the old, shining brighter upon a world reborn. Yet even in this renewed world, the spirit of Loki would not be forgotten. Though his body lay still upon Vigrid, his essence, like the chaos he embodied, remained woven into the fabric of existence. For as long as there is order, there will always be the whisper of disorder, a reminder that nothing remains unchanged forever. And so, in the quiet dawn of a new age, when the rivers ran clear and the forests stretched wide beneath a gentle sun, those who remembered the old stories spoke softly of Lokino as a monster, but as a force that ensured the world would never grow stagnant. His tale was not one of simple villainy, but of balance, of the necessary dance between creation and destruction. Wherever a question was asked, wherever a rule was broken for the sake of discovery, wherever laughter rang out in defiance of fear, there somewhere, unseen, the spirit of Loki smiled. Not as a god to be worshipped, nor as a specter to be feared, but as a quiet presence reminding the world that even in the most ordered of realms, a little chaos is what keeps life moving forward. As the new world unfolded from the remnants of the old, the tales of gods and giants became echoes, drifting across meadows and mountains where no battles had been fought. The scars of Ragnarok faded beneath fresh grass and blooming trees, but stories lingered longer than stone or bone. Among them, none were told with more hesitation, curiosity, and quiet reverence than the tales of Loki. In this reborn world, there were no grand temples dedicated to his name, no statues carved in his likeness. Yet around hearths, beneath starlit skies, the memory of the trickster god persisted, not as a figure of worship, but as a symbol woven into the very rhythm of existence. For the people of this new age, Loki was not merely a relic of a past catastrophe, but a reminder that the forces shaping their lives were not always clear-cut or bound by simple notions of good and evil. Elders would gather children and speak of the days when gods walked the realms, when Loki's laughter could be heard echoing through Asgard's golden halls. They would tell of his cleverness, show he outwitted giants, saved the gods from peril, and brought forth treasures that shaped the fate of many. But as the stories continued, they would shift in tone, recounting how that same cleverness revealed uncomfortable truths, how Loki's mischief evolved into defiance, and how defiance became the spark that led to Ragnarok. Yet, even in these tales of doom, there was an undercurrent of admiration. For while the gods represented order, strength, and tradition, Loki represented something far more elusive: the spirit of change, the courage to question, the refusal to accept that any system, no matter how divinest, shall go unchallenged. It was said that where the gods demanded obedience, Loki inspired thought. Where others enforced rules, Loki asked why those rules existed at all. In villages scattered across Midgard, people began to understand that the essence of Loki was not confined to the past. When a farmer found a clever way to outsmart a harsh season, when a traveler took an unexpected path and discovered fortune, when a poet dared to speak truths that others feared to voice, there, in those moments, was the quiet echo of Loki's legacy. But legends also warned of the dangers that came with invoking the trickster's spirit carelessly. For chaos, while a source of creativity and freedom, could just as easily tip into ruin if not tempered with wisdom. It was a delicate balance, the dance between embracing the unknown and respecting the fragile harmony that held life together. Those who walked too far into mischief without understanding its weight were said to lose themselves, becoming shadows of what they once were. In Asgard, rebuilt by the surviving gods, the memory of Loki was treated with a solemn complexity. Vidar, Vali, Modi, and Magni understood that the world they now governed had been shaped as much by Loki's actions as by their fathers. They did not speak his name with anger, nor did they erase him from their histories. Instead, they preserved the truth that, without Loki, the old world would have stagnated beneath the weight of its own perfection. His chaos had been the fire that forced renewal. It was even said that, on certain nights when the wind carried whispers through the branches of Yggdrasil, the young gods could almost hear a faint laugh. Not mocking, but knowing a reminder that no matter how carefully they built their new order, the spirit of unpredictability would always find a way to stir. Some believed that Loki's essence had scattered across the realms, embedding itself in the places where boundaries blurred, at the edges of forests where paths shifted, in the reflections of rivers that never showed the same image twice, in the sudden gusts of wind that carried away carefully laid plans. Wherever certainty grew too rigid, a little mischief would slip through, loosening the knots before they could choke the life from the world. And so, Loki became more than a figure of mythi, became a force of nature, as integral to existence as the turning of seasons or the rise and fall of tides. His story was not one to be mourned, nor blindly celebrated, but understood. A tale that carried lessons about the need for balance, for questioning, for embracing both order and the beautiful unpredictability that gives life its spark. In time, poets and storytellers began to weave new tales not of Loki's past deeds, but of how his spirit influenced the present. These stories told of wanderers meeting strange figures at crossroads, of riddles whispered in dreams, of unexpected twists of fate that saved villages or toppled tyrants. And though these figures were never named, listeners knew, somewhere behind those events was the echo of Loki's eternal smile. Thus, as generations passed beneath the ever-watchful stars, the people of Midgard learned to live with a quiet reverence for the unseen forces that shaped their lives. They honored the gods who brought structure and protection, but they also left a place in their hearts for the unpredictable, for the moments when plans unraveled and something unexpected led them to a better path. In those moments, they would offer a small, knowing nod to the wind, and perhaps, if they listened closely enough, they might hear a soft chuckle carried on the breeze, a reminder that Loki, the trickster, the catalyst, the necessary chaos, was never truly gone. As seasons turned and the new world settled into its rhythm, the sharp edges of old stories softened, worn down by time and retelling. The fierce battles of gods and giants became distant echoes, and the name of Lokians, spoken with a mix of fear, resentment, and reluctant respect, became part of the fabric of everyday life, not as a warning, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the unpredictable nature of existence. In quiet villages where farmers tilled fertile soil and fishermen cast their nets into calm waters, people began to see Loki not as the bringer of ruin, but as the spirit behind life's little surprises. When storms came unexpectedly, only to reveal richer harvests in their aftermath, when lost travelers stumbled upon hidden paths leading to fortune, when stubborn problems found solutions through unconventional thinking there, they sensed the unseen hand of the trickster. Children, wide-eyed and eager for tales, would gather around the elders to hear stories of Loki's cleverness. But unlike the grim warnings of earlier generations, these stories now carried a tone of wonder. They spoke of a god who dared to ask questions no one else would, who found answers in places others feared to look, who reminded even the mightiest that pride could blind them to their own flaws. One favorite tale among these was the story of how Loki once saved Asgard from a threat that no sword or hammer could defeat, not through trickery alone, but through understanding the nature of those he opposed. The story began with a giantess who approached Asgard, not with an army, but with a riddle so complex that it threatened to unravel the gods' very sense of reality. The gods, bound by their honor and unable to admit ignorance, struggled in vain to solve it. It was Loki, with his ever-curious mind, who saw that the riddle was not meant to be answered in the way the gods expected. He realized that sometimes the solution lay not in finding a definitive answer, but in changing the perspective entirely. With a single, clever twist of words, he turned the riddle back upon the giantess, forcing her to reveal that the true challenge had been to test the gods' willingness to think beyond their rigid ways. This tale, like so many others, became a lesson passed down through generations, not about deceit, but about adaptability, about the courage to see beyond tradition and embrace the unknown. It reminded people that while strength could protect, it was wit and flexibility that often ensured survival when the world shifted beneath their feet. As the years rolled on, shrines were quietly erected, not grand temples, but small markers at crossroads, river bends, or forest clearings, places where choices were made and paths diverged. Travelers would leave a token or whisper a few words, not as prayers in the conventional sense, but as a nod to the unseen force that governed twists of fate. These offerings weren't meant to appease, but to acknowledge, to show respect for the dance between certainty and surprise. In Asgard, the young gods watched this quiet reverence with a mixture of caution and understanding. They knew well the history behind these gestures. They had inherited a world rebuilt from chaos, and they carried within them the memory of how easily order could be upended. Yet, unlike their forebears, they did not seek to suppress the spirit of Loki. They understood now that attempting to cage chaos only made it more dangerous. Instead, they allowed space for it to exist within reason, recognizing that a world too tightly bound by rules would eventually suffocate itself. It was said that Vidar, the silent and steadfast son of Odin, would sometimes walk alone through the forests of Midgard, pausing at these humble shrines. No words would pass his lips, but those who saw him claimed there was a faint smile beneath his usually stoic expressiona, silent acknowledgement of the role Loki had played in shaping the world they now protected. Among mortals, philosophers and storytellers began to frame Loki not as a mere character of myth, but as a conceptive force that lived wherever boundaries were tested and where new ideas were born. They spoke of him when discussing the nature of change, of how every ending carried within it the seed of a new beginning, and how chaos, when understood rather than feared, could lead to growth rather than destruction. In this way, Loki became timeless, not bound to the past, nor confined to the fate that had once cast him as a destroyer. His story evolved, as all living stories do, reflecting the needs and understandings of each generation that told it. And though the details of his exploits might shift with each retelling, the essence remained the same, a reminder that life thrives not in stillness, but in motion, in the delicate balance between what is known and what is possible. So, when a sudden gust of wind changed a sailor's course for the better, or when a clever word diffused a brewing conflict, people would smile softly to themselves. Not out of fear, but out of gratitude for the unpredictable turns that made life richer and more vibrant. For in every twist of fate, in every unexpected turn of fortune, Loki's presence could still be felt not as a threat lurking in the shadows, but as a quiet companion on the journey through a world forever in flux. As the generations passed and the world grew comfortable in its newfound harmony, there remained an unspoken understanding among those who lived beneath the sky, a quiet awareness that perfection was an illusion, and that beneath the surface of even the most ordered life, chaos patiently waited. It was not a threat, but a truth, a reminder that change was inevitable and necessary. And at the heart of that truth, whether named aloud or left to silent thought, was Loki. In cities where craftsmen shaped wonders from wood and stone, and in villages where farmers read the signs of the seasons, people learned to welcome the unexpected. A broken tool that led to a better design, a missed path that revealed a safer road. These were not seen as misfortunes, but as subtle gifts from the unseen hand that nudged life forward in ways no plan could predict. It was said that those who cursed their bad luck too quickly often missed the hidden blessing that followed. Among the storytellers and skalds, a new genre of tales began to emerge, where the hero was not the strongest warrior or the most pious devotee of the gods, but the clever individual who embraced uncertainty, who dared to laugh in the face of rigid tradition. These characters, inspired by the lingering spirit of Loki, navigated their worlds with wit and adaptability, proving that survival and success often belong to those who could dance with chaos rather than flee from it. One such tale spoke of a young woman who lived in a village plagued by a terrible drought. While others prayed endlessly to the gods for rain, she observed the land and noticed how a nearby river had subtly shifted its course over the years. Ignoring the elders' warnings not to interfere with nature's will, she devised a plan to redirect the water back toward the fields. Her solution was unconventional, even frowned upon at first, but when the crops flourished once more, the village quietly honored her cleverness. At the edge of the river, they placed a small stone, carved with a simple symbol of fox's tail curling into a spiral, a silent tribute to the trickster's spirit that had guided her thinking. These stories, though humble, carried profound lessons. They taught that wisdom was not found solely in ancient texts or decrees from above, but in the willingness to see the world differently, to question, to adapt, to find opportunity where others saw only obstacles. And though the gods still held their place in the heavens, it was clear that among mortals, a deeper appreciation had grown for the balance between order and unpredictability. In Asgard, the young gods watched this evolution with careful eyes. They understood that mortals were not rejecting the divine, but rather embracing a fuller understanding of existence, one that made room for both structure and spontaneity. Vidar, with his quiet strength, and Magni, inheritor of Thor's might, often discussed how best to guide this new world without repeating the mistakes of their forefathers. It was during one such discussion that a thought emerged, perhaps the greatest lesson left behind by Loki was not in his actions, but in what he revealed about the nature of power itself. That true strength was not just in maintaining control, but in knowing when to let go, when to allow the world to shift and reshape itself without interference. To trust that life, in all its unpredictability, had its own wisdom. And so, the gods took a step back from mortal affairs, allowing humans to chart their own paths more freely than ever before. They watched as societies flourished, not because they were shielded from chaos, but because they had learned to coexist with it, to see it not as a force of destruction, but as a partner in growth. In the quiet places of the world, where rivers met forests, where mountains cast long shadows over open plains, there were still those who claimed to feel Loki's presence most strongly. Travelers spoke of moments when they felt guided by an unseen force, leading them away from danger or toward unexpected fortune. Some claimed to hear faint laughter when plans unraveled, only to discover that the change led them somewhere better. These were not grand miracles, nor were they terrifying omens. They were gentle reminders that the world was alive with possibilities far beyond human understanding. And in that mystery, in that dance between what was known and what could never be fully predicted, Loki's essence thrived. As twilight settled over the land and fires crackled in hearths, the storytellers continued to pass down these tales not as relics of a bygone age, but as living wisdom. Children grew up hearing that while it was good to honor tradition and respect the gods, it was equally important to keep one's mind open, to question, to adapt, and to never fear the unexpected knock at the door of fate. For in every twist and turn of life's journey, there remained a spark of the trickster, a quiet companion walking beside those who dared to think differently, who found courage not in certainty, but in the endless possibilities that came with embracing the unknown. And so, as stars wheeled overhead and the wind carried whispers through the trees, the world moved forward not in spite of chaos, but because of it. Loki's legacy was not carved in stone or sung in solemn hymns. It lived in every moment where life surprised those bold enough to listen. In the gentle hush of twilight, when the world felt suspended between day and night, there were those who swore they could hear faint echoes of ancient laughter carried on the wind. Not mocking, but playful, a soft reminder that, even in the calmest moments, the spirit of mischief still lingered. It was during these quiet hours that people reflected on the stories passed down through countless generations, the tales of gods and giants, of creation and destruction, and most curiously, of Loki. For by now, Loki's story had transformed into something far greater than a tale of a single being. It had become a symbol, an ever-present thread in the fabric of life, woven through every moment where plans shifted, where expectations were overturned, and where new paths were forged from the unexpected. The trickster was no longer seen as just a figure of legend, but as a force that lived in every choice that required courage to embrace uncertainty. In the bustling towns that had grown along rivers and trade routes, merchants and travelers often invoked Loki's Namanat as a curse, but as a companion on the road. Deals struck with clever words, narrow escapes from danger, or fortunate turns of fate were met with knowing smiles and quiet nods to the unseen hand that had guided them through. A coin flipped into a fountain, a carved token left at a crossroads. These small gestures were ways to honor the presence that watched over those willing to walk the less predictable path. Scholars, too, began to study the old myths with fresh eyes. In grand libraries where scrolls chronicled the deeds of gods, thinkers debated Loki's role in the grand tapestry of existence. Some argued that he was the embodiment of necessary chaos, the force that ensured growth through disruption. Others suggested that Loki represented the freedom of thought itself, the spark that led beings to question, to imagine, and to reshape their world beyond the constraints of tradition. Among these scholars, one theory became widely accepted, that Loki's greatest gift was not his tricks or his schemes, but his ability to reveal hidden truths. Where others saw only what they wished to see, Loki peeled back the layers, exposing the flaws, the hypocrisies, and the fragility beneath. He forced gods and mortals alike to confront realities they would rather ignore, and though this often led to discomfort, even pain, it also led to transformation. In this light, Loki's actions during the final days of the old world were no longer viewed solely as betrayal, but as the culmination of a role that had been written long before he ever set foot in Asgard. The world had grown too rigid, too certain of its own permanence. Without Loki's chaos to break it apart, there could have been no rebirth, no fresh beginning for those who came after. This understanding brought a sense of peace to those who once feared the unpredictable. Parents taught their children that while stability was important, it was equally vital to remain open to change, to adapt when the winds shifted, and to find opportunity in the unexpected. Festivals were even held in honor of mischief, not to encourage harm, but to celebrate creativity, cleverness, and the joy of seeing the world through different eyes. During these festivals, masks were worn, disguises donned, and riddles exchanged in the streets. Laughter echoed through villages and cities alike, as people played tricks on one another, harmless pranks that reminded everyone that life was not meant to be taken too seriously. At the heart of these celebrations was the unspoken acknowledgement of Loki's enduring influence, a recognition that mischief, when guided by wit and kindness, could bring people together and spark moments of genuine connection. Far from the laughter of mortals, in the quiet heights of Asgard, the gods watched these traditions unfold with quiet contemplation. They, too, had learned from the past. No longer did they seek to suppress the spirit of change, but rather to guide it, to ensure that chaos and order danced in harmony rather than conflict. They understood now that balance was not a static state, but a living, breathing relationship between forces constantly in motion. And somewhere beyond the veil of the known world, where the boundaries between myth and reality blurred, it was said that Loki's spirit wandered freely, not bound by form or place, but moving wherever curiosity and courage stirred hearts. He was the whisper in a dream that led to a new idea, the sudden inspiration that turned failure into success, the unexpected encounter that changed the course of a life. As night deepened and stars shimmered overhead, those who gazed up at the sky would sometimes wonder if Loki watched back not as a god seeking worship, but as a companion in the eternal journey of discovery. For in every heart that dared to question, to explore, to laugh in the face of fear, Loki's legacy lived on, not as a shadow of chaos, but as a guiding light through the ever-changing landscape of existence. And so, the story of Loki continued, not confined to the pages of ancient texts or the fading memories of elder gods, but alive in every moment where life surprised those who thought they had it all figured out. His was a tale without end, a reminder that in the dance of creation and destruction, of order and disorder, it is often the unexpected step that leads to the most beautiful rhythms. As dawn broke over a world shaped by countless cycles of order and chaos, there remained a quiet reverence for the forces that could never be fully controlled. Among these forces, none were more elusive, more quietly celebrated than the spirit of Loki. Though the gods had long since retreated from mortal sight, and the great events of Ragnarok had faded into legend, the influence of the trickster continued to weave itself through daily life, subtle but undeniable. In marketplaces where merchants bartered with quick tongues and sharper minds, it was common to hear someone remark, with a knowing grin, that Loki must be smiling upon a particularly clever deal. When a child outwitted an elder with playful mischief, laughter would follow, not scolding, and someone would inevitably say that the youngster had a bit of the trickster's spirit in them. These moments were not seen as disruptions, but as reminders that wit and adaptability were as valuable as strength and tradition. Travelers told stories of strange encounters on lonely roadside, meeting mysterious figures who offered riddles instead of directions, or who traded guidance for a clever answer rather than coin. These wanderers, often described as wearing a glint in their eye and a smile that hinted at hidden knowledge, would vanish as quickly as they appeared. Though no one could prove it, many believed these were glimpses of Loki's lingering presence, still roaming where the edges of the world blurred and certainty gave way to mystery. In the halls of learning, where scholars debated philosophy and the nature of existence, Loki's name was often invoked when discussing the necessity of questioning accepted truths. Professors would remind their students that while knowledge was a pillar of stability, it was curiosity and the courage to challenge old ideas that led to true wisdom. Loki, in this sense, became a patron of thinkers and dreamers, those who refused to let their minds grow stagnant within the walls of convention. Even within the quiet sanctuaries where the gods of the New Age were honored, priests spoke of Balanceno as a rigid structure, but as a living relationship between forces seen and unseen. While prayers were offered to deities of harvest, protection, and prosperity, a small space was always left for the unknown, a silent acknowledgement that not all blessings came in predictable forms. When unexpected fortune arrived, or when misfortune revealed itself to be a hidden gift, people would offer a quiet thanks to the trickster, who reminded them that life was never meant to follow a straight path. In this way, Loki's story transcended its origins. No longer confined to the narrative of a god who rose, rebelled, and fell, it became a philosophy woven into the hearts of those who understood that resilience came not from resisting change, but from embracing it. His legacy was not carved into monuments or enforced through doctrine. It lived in the adaptability of people who learned to see opportunity in disruption, who found strength in flexibility, and who understood that sometimes the greatest wisdom came from laughing when plans unraveled. As time moved forward, new myths began to take shape, stories not of the old gods and their battles, but of ordinary people who embodied the spirit of those ancient forces. In these tales, heroes were not always noble warriors or devout followers of tradition. Often, they were clever souls who defied expectations, who solved problems through ingenuity rather than might, and who weren't afraid to question the rules when the rules no longer served the greater good. These stories were told beside fires, in classrooms, and whispered among friends facing uncertain futures. And always, at the heart of them, was a quiet homage to the one who had first taught the world that chaos was not something to fear, but something to understand, to dance with, rather than fight against. It was said that in the deepest parts of the forests, where few dared to wander, there were places where reality felt thinner, where paths seemed to shift when no one was looking, and where strange symbols appeared on stones without explanation. Those who ventured into these places and returned often spoke of feeling changed, not by fear, but by a sense of having glimpsed a deeper truth, that the world was far more alive, far more unpredictable than anyone could fully grasp. Some claim that if you stood still in these places, listening closely enough, you might hear the faintest sound of laughter, light, fleeting, and full of knowing. Whether it was the wind through the trees or something more, no one could say for certain. But those who heard it often returned home with a renewed sense of curiosity, a willingness to let go of rigid plans, and a quiet smile that suggested they understood just a little more about the nature of things. And so, as the world continued its endless cycle of growth and change, the spirit of Loki remained not as a relic of a forgotten past, but as a constant companion to those who dared to embrace life's unpredictability. His tale was no longer just a story of rise, chaos, and fall. It had become a living reminder that within every twist of fate, every unexpected turn, there lies the potential for something new, something better. For as long as there are questions left to ask, roads left unexplored, and laughter shared in the face of uncertainty, Loki's presence endures ever changing, ever smiling, guiding those who understand that true wisdom is found not in fearing chaos, but in learning to move with it. As centuries unfolded like pages in an endless book, the story of Loki drifted further from the rigid definitions once imposed upon it. No longer was he remembered solely as the trickster who brought ruin or the cunning god who defied the Aesir. Instead, his tale became a quiet undercurrent in the lives of those who sensed that the world itself was a living, shifting thing, a place where certainty was an illusion, and where the unexpected was often a hidden guide. In the hearts of sailors who ventured across unpredictable seas, Loki's name was whispered not in fear, but with a kind of respectful familiarity. When storms rose without warning, and when calm waters suddenly revealed new horizons, they understood that the ocean danced to rhythms beyond mortal control. And somewhere in that dance was the spirit of the one who thrived in unpredictability. A coin tossed into the waves, or a playful toast to the wind, was often enough to acknowledge that unseen presence. Artists and musicians, too, found inspiration in the legacy of Loki. They spoke of moments when creativity struck like a bolt from the blue ideas that defied convention, melodies that wove themselves without conscious thought. These flashes of brilliance, unpredictable and fleeting, were seen as gifts from the same force that had once turned Asgard on its head with a clever word or a daring jest. In studios and workshops, symbols of the trickster were carved into corners or painted onto canvases not as icons of worship, but as invitations to embrace the wild spark of inspiration whenever it chose to appear. In quiet gatherings beneath starlit skies, philosophers debated the nature of chaos not as destruction, but as the fertile ground from which all new things must grow. They argued that without Loki's influence, the world would have remained static, locked in a cycle of repetition where nothing truly evolved. It was through disruption that life learned to adapt, to survive, and to flourish. In this way, Loki was seen not as an adversary to order, but as its necessary counterpart. The force that ensured order never calcified into stagnation. Among the old stones and forgotten ruins of temples long abandoned, travelers sometimes stumbled upon carvings that told fragments of the ancient tales images of a figure whose shape seemed to shift from one panel to the next. A fox here, a serpent there, a laughing man whose eyes held secrets too deep to name. These remnants were not grand monuments, but subtle reminders that the world had always known the value of the trickster, even when it pretended otherwise. In families, stories of Loki were passed down with a mixture of amusement and quiet reverence. Parents would tell their children that when life didn't go as planned, when doors closed, or paths twisted unexpectedly, it wasn't always a misfortune. Sometimes, it was Loki's way of guiding them towards something they hadn't yet imagined. This teaching became a source of comfort in uncertain times, a gentle reminder that flexibility and humor could turn obstacles into opportunities. There were even those who dedicated their lives to walking what they called the crooked path, a way of living that embraced uncertainty, that sought out challenges not to conquer them through force, but to learn from them, to grow with them. These wanderers, philosophers, and quiet mischief makers carried no banners, founded no orders, but their influence was felt wherever rigid thinking gave way to creative solutions. It was said that these followers of the crooked path would often find themselves in places where the world felt thinner, where reality itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. In these liminal spaces sat the edge of forests where mist clung to ancient trees, atop hills where the wind carried voices of forgotten songs. They would pause, feeling the presence of something just beyond sight. A playful nudge, a whispered riddle, a reminder that they were never truly alone in their journey through the unpredictable currents of life. The gods, distant and watching from realms unseen, allowed these quiet honors to persist. They had learned, through the fires of Ragnarok and the rebirth that followed, that to deny chaos was to deny half of existence itself. Balance was no longer enforced through dominance, but maintained through respect for both the structures that held the world together and the forces that kept it from becoming brittle and lifeless. And so, as the moon rose and fell, as rivers carved new paths through old lands, and as people laughed at missteps that led to unexpected joys, Loki's influence remained, not as a force to be feared, but as a companion to those willing to embrace the beautiful uncertainty of life. In every story retold, in every lesson shared about the value of cleverness over brute strength, and in every quiet moment when plans unraveled only to reveal a better way forward, the spirit of the trickster lived one eternal, smiling, and forever reminding the world that the most meaningful journeys are the ones where the destination is unknown, and where each step is guided by curiosity, courage, and a touch of mischief. As the quiet centuries unfolded, and the memories of gods became whispers in the wind, Loki's tale continued to live where it had always belonged, not in grand halls or written decrees, but in the small, fleeting moments where life surprised those who walked through it. His presence was not bound by temples or rituals, but by the choices people made when faced with the unexpected. When plans fell apart, and they found themselves smiling instead of despairing. In the villages nestled between mountains and seas, elders spoke of Loki not as a distant deity, but as a familiar spirit of force that danced at the edges of everyday life. They would remind the young that when things didn't go as expected, it wasn't always misfortune knocking at the door. Sometimes it was a nudge in a new direction, an unseen hand pushing them towards something they hadn't yet dared to imagine. There was a saying that grew popular across these lands: leave room for the twist. It became a quiet mantra, a reminder that no matter how carefully one planned, the world had a way of shifting beneath your feet, and that this was not a curse, but a gift. Farmers would smile when an unexpected rain ruined one crop but nourished another. Sailors would adjust their course when winds defied predictions, trusting that the new path held its own treasures. In this way, Loki's legacy wove itself into the very mindset of those who lived close to nature, who understood that control was often an illusion. Rather than resisting change, they learned to flow with it, to laugh when the unexpected arrived, and to find opportunity where others saw only chaos. In bustling towns where merchants bartered and craftsmen shaped wonders, cleverness was celebrated as much as skill. Those who could think on their feet, who could turn a setback into success with a quick word or an inventive idea, were said to be favored by the trickster's spirit. Marketplaces echoed with playful banter, deals struck with a wink, and stories of how fortune favored those who didn't cling too tightly to rigid plans. Among poets and musicians, inspiration was often attributed to Loki's influence. When a melody came unbidden in the middle of the night, or when words flowed onto parchment without effort, it was said that the trickster had passed by, leaving behind a spark of creativity. Artists learned to cherish these unpredictable moments, understanding that true brilliance often came not from careful planning, but from embracing the wild, untamed flow of thought. In some places, festivals were held in quiet honor of this spirit of mischief, not grand ceremonies, but light-hearted gatherings where masks were worn, riddles exchanged, and harmless pranks played. These celebrations reminded communities that laughter and flexibility were as important to survival as strength or discipline. It was a time when hierarchies dissolved, when the old could jest with the young, and when everyone was encouraged to see the world through different eyes, if only for a night. And far from the laughter and lights, in the solitude of scholars' chambers and philosophers' circles, deeper discussions unfolded. They spoke of Loki as a symbol of transformation, not just of events, but of thought itself. They debated how societies could thrive only when they left space for dissent, for questioning, for the kind of creative disruption that prevented stagnation. In these circles, Loki was no villain, but a guardian of intellectual freedom, the embodiment of the idea that progress often began with a single, unsettling question. It was said that those who followed this line of thinking, the quiet rebels, the innovators, the dreamers, often carried small tokens in their pockets or wore subtle charms, not to invoke protection, but as a reminder to stay open to the unexpected. A twisted piece of metal, a stone with an unusual shape, a carved fox or serpent each symbolized the beauty found in life's crooked paths. In stories passed from parent to child, Loki's adventures were retold, not just the tales of his mischief in Asgard, but the lessons hidden within them. The tale of Sif's golden hair, once a story of prank and punishment, became a teaching about how mistakes could lead to unexpected gifts. The story of Thor's stolen hammer was no longer just a humorous tale, but a reminder that pride sometimes needed to be set aside in favor of clever solutions. And so, Loki's story evolved with each telling, shaped by the needs and understandings of those who carried it forward. It was no longer bound to the fate of gods or the doom of Ragnarok, but lived on as a guide through the uncertainties of everyday life. As night would fall and stars would scatter across the sky, travelers sitting by their campfires would often share quiet thoughts about the unseen forces that shaped their journeys. They would smile at the twists of fate that had led them to unexpected places, and some would raise a cup to the night air, offering a silent toast to the trickster who ensured that life was never too predictable. For in every unexpected meeting, every fortunate mistake, every plan gone awry only to reveal a better outcome, Loki's presence was felt not as a force of malice, but as a companion in the dance of life's ever-changing rhythms. And so, the world moved forward, guided not just by laws and traditions, but by the quiet wisdom passed through generations. That to live fully was to embrace the unknown, to laugh when the path twisted, and to trust that sometimes it is the unexpected that leads us exactly where we are meant to be. There were those who believed that Loki never truly left the world, not in spirit, nor in presence. Though his name had passed into legend, whispered in stories, and echoed in moments of unexpected fortune, some claimed that he still wandered the hidden paths where few dared to tread. Not as a god-seeking follower, but as a restless wind, moving wherever curiosity stirred and where the boundaries of fate loosened just enough to let mischief slip through. In remote places where forests grew thick and ancient trees leaned close, as if sharing secrets, travelers spoke of strange encounters. A figure seen at the edge of vision, shifting shape like a shadow in moonlight. A voice offering riddles with no clear answer. A sudden twist of the path leading to safety when danger seemed certain. These stories were shared in hushed tones by those who knew that not every guide wore a familiar face, and that sometimes salvation came dressed in confusion. Among the wanderers and those who made their lives on the road, it became tradition to carry a tokenet for protection, but as a sign of respect to the unpredictable. A small, imperfect stone, a feather twisted by the wind, or a coin with a hole worn through it. These items weren't charms in the traditional sense, but reminders to remain flexible, to expect the unexpected, and to greet surprise with a smile, rather than fear. Villages that sat near these wild places developed their own customs. Before embarking on important journeys or making significant decisions, people would leave a small offering at crossroads or river bends, places where choices were made and where fate could turn without warning. A piece of bread, a carved symbol, or a simple whispered word was enough to acknowledge the unseen force that might nudge events toward fortune or folly, depending on how one faced the challenges ahead. In the growing cities where order reigned and walls were built high to keep chaos at bay, Loki's influence was less openly discussed, but still felt. Merchants who thrived on clever deals, architects who designed buildings with hidden quirks, playwrights who filled their works with unexpected twists all paid silent homage to the spirit of creativity born from unpredictability. They understood that even within structured lives, it was the moments of surprise that gave color and meaning to existence. There was a quiet wisdom that spread through these communities, that too much control could suffocate, and that leaving space for spontaneity allowed life to flourish in ways no plan could predict. Schools taught children to think critically, to question not just what was wrong, but also why certain things were considered right. This openness of thought, this encouragement to explore beyond rigid boundaries, was seen as a gift inherited from the tales of the trickster. And still, high above mortal concerns, the gods watched. From their distant realms, they observed how the world had changed not through force or decree, but through the slow, persistent influence of an idea. That balance was not the absence of chaos, but the harmony found when order and disorder danced together. The young gods, wiser for the lessons of their ancestors, no longer feared the unpredictable. Instead, they respected it, knowing that without Loki's legacy, the world they protected would have become brittle and lifeless long ago. It was said that Odin, even in the afterlife where only the echoes of gods remained, would occasionally reflect on his long-forgotten oath of brotherhood with Loki. Some believed that in those quiet moments beyond time, Odin did not dwell on betrayal or regret, but on the understanding that without the trickster by his side, many of the greatest stories of the old world would never have been written. And so, Loki's story endured not as a closed chapter, but as an ever-evolving thread woven into the lives of those who embraced curiosity, adaptability, and the courage to face uncertainty with open eyes and an open heart. As night skies stretched wide over a world alive with possibility, storytellers continued to share tales of the trickster, not to warn, but to inspire. They spoke of how, in every unexpected turn, there was a chance to grow, how laughter in the face of adversity could turn fear into freedom, and how those who dared to question the path laid before them often found new roads that led to places no map could show. In these stories, Loki was no longer just the figure who rose, rebelled, and fell. He was the whisper at the edge of thought, the flicker of inspiration when all seemed lost, the quiet reminder that life's greatest treasures were often hidden in moments of surprise. Thus, from the smallest village to the grandest city, from solitary travelers to scholars in high towers, the legacy of Loki continued not as a force to be controlled, but as a companion for those willing to walk the winding road, trusting that even when the destination was unclear, the journey itself would be worth every twist and turn. As the winds of time carried the world ever forward, the presence of Loki became less a figure bound to ancient myths and more a quiet, persistent current beneath the surface of daily life. His name was not always spoken, but his influence could be felt wherever flexibility triumphed over rigidity, wherever cleverness outshone brute force, and wherever people learned to smile in the face of the unexpected. In places where the old stories were still told beneath starry skies or by the flickering glow of hearth fires, elders would remind listeners that the trickster's greatest gift was not chaos for its own sake, but the wisdom to see beyond the obvious, to understand that when the world shifts beneath your feet, it is offering you a chance not to fall, but to find a new way forward. Among sailors charting courses across uncertain seas, Loki's spirit was a trusted companion. Navigating waters that refused to obey the maps, they learned that no journey ever truly went as planned, and that was where the adventure lived. A sudden storm that blew them off course could lead to the discovery of safer harbors or richer fishing grounds. And when such fortune arrived, they would tip their hats to the wind and offer a quiet thanks to the unseen hand that guided those willing to adapt. In the bustling workshops of inventors and artisans, mistakes were no longer feared but welcomed as opportunities in disguise. When a design failed, it often revealed a better solution hidden within the error. These moments of accidental brilliance were said to be gifts from the trickster, reminders that creativity flourishes not in perfect plans, but in the willingness to explore what lies beyond them. Even within courts and councils, where rulers once sought to impose absolute order, there grew an understanding that wisdom did not come from controlling every outcome. Advisors who could think like the trickster, who could navigate the complexities of diplomacy with humor, cunning, and a touch of unpredictability, were valued above those who clung too tightly to rigid protocols. Leaders began to recognize that true strength lay not in resisting change, but in mastering the art of moving with it. And so, across all walks of life, people learned to embrace a simple truth: that the world was not meant to be tamed, but to be engaged with curiosity and grace. This mindset transformed how communities dealt with hardship and fortune alike. When floods altered the landscape, villages didn't just rebuild, they adapted, finding new ways to thrive in places they once avoided. When traditions no longer served the needs of the people, they were reshaped, not discarded, honoring the past while making room for the future. In these quiet revolutions of thought and action, Loki's legacy lived on, not in grand declarations, but in the subtle ways people chose to face the unknown. It was reflected in the laughter shared after plans unraveled, in the resilience found when certainty gave way to possibility, and in the stories that reminded each generation that life's greatest moments often come when we least expect them. There were, of course, those who still feared the unpredictable, who viewed change as a threat rather than an opportunity. In some corners of the world, attempts were made to stamp out the influence of the old Telesto, enforce strict rules to control every aspect of life in the name of stability. But even in these places, the spirit of the trickster found a way in. A clever word here, a fortunate accident there. Small cracks in the walls of certainty that reminded all who witnessed them that no system, no matter how tightly woven, could hold back the tide of change forever. And in the quiet moments, when the world held its breath between what was and what could be, there were those who claimed to hear faint echoes, not loud or intrusive, but a soft chuckle carried on the breeze. A gentle reminder that Loki was never truly gone. He lived wherever questions were asked, wherever boundaries were tested, and wherever hearts remained open to the adventure of the unknown. For in every decision to take the unbeaten path, in every choice to see possibility where others saw only risk, people unknowingly walked with the trickster at their side, not as a guide leading them toward chaos, but as a companion encouraging them to see that life's beauty often lies in its unpredictability. And so, as the world continued to evolve, shaped by hands willing to mold it rather than control it, Loki's influence remained steady and unseen, a quiet force reminding all who listen that to live fully is to dance with the unexpected, to find joy in the twists of fate, and to trust that even when the road bends away from where you thought it would lead, it is still taking you exactly where you need to go. In the quiet spaces between civilization and wilderness, where the roads grew thin and the forests thickened, stories of Loki found fertile ground. These were places where the world felt less certain, where paths shifted with the seasons, and where travelers learned to trust instinct over maps. It was here, more than anywhere else, that people understood the value of unpredictability not as a threat, but as a natural rhythm of life. Wanderers spoke of crossroads, where strange encounters could change a destiny. A lone figure, cloaked in shadow or light depending on who told the tale, might appear to offer a choice, a riddle, or a simple piece of advice wrapped in humor. Those who accepted the uncertainty of these meetings often found themselves led to unexpected fortune, to lessons they didn't know they needed. Those who resisted, clinging too tightly to their planned routes, were said to miss opportunities that would never come again. Villagers who lived near these shifting places left small offerings at trail marker stones, stacked in curious patterns, bits of woven thread tied to tree branches, or tokens carved with symbols of foxes, serpents, or twisting paths. These gestures weren't acts of worship, but acknowledgments, quiet agreements with the unseen forces that shaped the turns of fate. They knew that to walk through life was to accept that control was limited, and that often the best outcomes came from embracing the unexpected. In more structured towns and cities, where walls and rules gave the illusion of permanence, the influence of Loki took on subtler forms. It lived in the innovators who challenged outdated traditions, in the storytellers who reminded people to laugh at themselves, and in the moments when even the most carefully laid plans were overturned by chance only, to reveal a better way forward. There was a growing understanding that chaos was not the opposite of order, but its partner. Too much of one without the other led to collapse, either into rigid stagnation or into formless confusion. The wisdom of the ages began to reflect this balance, teaching that a good life was not about eliminating uncertainty, but about learning to move with it, to adjust when needed, to remain flexible, and to find joy in life's surprises. Schools taught children that mistakes were not failures, but invitations to see problems from new angles. Communities celebrated not just their heroes of strength and discipline, but also those who brought clever solutions, who turned adversity into opportunity with a well-timed jest or an unconventional idea. Festivals honoring creativity and mischief grew in popularity, blending playfulness with respect for the deeper lessons hidden within laughter. Among the scholars and philosophers, debates continued about Loki's true nature. Was he a god of chaos, a force of nature, or something beyond categorization? The prevailing thought was that Loki represented the essence of transformation itself, the moment when what is known gives way to what could be. He was not bound by malice or virtue, but by the simple truth that nothing stays the same forever, and that growth often begins where certainty ends. These ideas began to shape how societies governed themselves. Laws became more adaptable, allowing for exceptions when rigid enforcement would cause harm. Leaders learned to listen not only to tradition, but to those voices that dared to question and offer new perspectives. It was understood that stability did not come from resisting change, but from flowing with it, guiding it where possible, but never trying to dam the river entirely. And through it all, the quiet presence of Loki remained not in grand displays, but in the subtle moments when life reminded people that they were part of a story still being written. A sudden change in weather that saved a harvest, a missed appointment that led to a chance meeting, a forgotten task that revealed a hidden blessing. These were the daily miracles attributed to the trickster's enduring influence. As night fell over fields and forests, cities and seas, people would look to the stars and remember that even the constellations told stories of movement and change. They knew that somewhere in the vastness of existence, the spirit of Loki watched not with judgment, but with a knowing smile, amused by the endless dance of order and chaos, of plans made and paths diverted. And so, life continued, shaped by hands willing to craft, hearts willing to adapt, and minds open to the twists that made each journey unique. Loki's tale, once thought to have ended in chains and shadow, had instead become eternal, not as a warning, but as a quiet celebration of life's unpredictable beauty. In every corner of the world, from the busiest markets to the loneliest mountain paths, people carried this understanding with them that to live fully was to welcome the unknown, to find courage in uncertainty, and to remember that sometimes, when the road bends unexpectedly, it is simply the trickster reminding you that the best stories are never the ones you planned. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world hovered between dreams and waking, many believed that this was the time Loki's spirit moved most freely. It was in these still moments that thoughts wandered, plans softened, and the mind opened itself to possibilities unbound by the constraints of daylight logic. Artists would rise early, inspired by ideas they could not explain. Travelers would change course on a whim, guided by instinct rather than destination. And those who listened closely might swear they heard faint laughter carried on the morning breeze. This belief that Loki was present in the spaces where certainty gave way to wonder became a quiet part of daily life. People began to see the value in pausing before rushing into decisions, in allowing room for intuition and chance to play their part. It wasn't superstition, but a recognition that life was richer when one accepted that not everything could or should be controlled. In towns where bells marked the hours and routines shaped the rhythm of the day, there were still those who left windows slightly ajar, doors unlocked for a moment longer than necessary, symbolic gestures to invite the unexpected in. These small acts served as reminders that while structure brought comfort, it was the unplanned moments that often brought the most profound change. Merchants learned to appreciate the unpredictability of markets, where fortunes could shift with a single conversation or a chance encounter. Farmers, long attuned to nature's whims, respected the delicate balance between preparation and adaptability. When weather defied forecasts or crops grew in strange patterns, they would shrug with a smile, acknowledging that some forces were beyond prediction, and that was not always a bad thing. In the halls where leaders gathered to debate the future, it became common practice to leave a single chair empty at the tablinot for a person, but as a symbolic seat for the unknown. This tradition served as a constant reminder that, no matter how carefully plans were laid, the world would always have a voice of its own, a voice that could not be silenced by law or decree. The presence of that empty chair encouraged humility, fostering a culture where flexibility was seen not as weakness, but as wisdom. Among storytellers, the tales of Loki continued to evolve. No longer confined to ancient myths, they became parables for modern life stories that illustrated how cleverness, humor, and a willingness to embrace change could turn even the direst situations into opportunities. These stories were told not just to entertain, but to teach resilience, creativity, and the importance of seeing beyond immediate appearances. One popular tale spoke of a village threatened by a landslide. While the elders debated how to reinforce the mountainside using traditional methods, a young girl noticed how the river had shifted nearby. Inspired by stories of Loki's unconventional thinking, she proposed redirecting the water to carve a new path, easing the pressure on the slope. Though her idea was met with skepticism, the villagers eventually agreed, and the solution not only saved the village, but created fertile land where none had existed before. The tale ended with the girl leaving a small offering at the river bend, thanking the spirit of mischief for inspiring her to see the problem differently. Such stories reinforced the understanding that Loki's influence was not about causing chaos for amusement, but about revealing paths unseen by those too focused on walking straight lines. He was the voice that asked, "What if there's another way?" A question that had saved more lives and sparked more innovations than any rule ever written. Even in the sacred spaces where the gods of the New Age were honored, priests and priestesses spoke of the necessity of balance. While they prayed for stability and guidance, they also offered quiet acknowledgments to the unpredictable forces that kept the world alive and moving. Festivals were held not just in praise of order, but in celebration of transformation, the moments when life surprised everyone and revealed beauty in the unexpected. As generations passed, this philosophy became ingrained in the culture of the world. People no longer feared change as they once had. Instead, they learned to greet it with open hands and open hearts, knowing that within every twist of fate lay the seeds of something new. Communities thrived not because they resisted the winds of change, but because they learned to sail with them, adjusting their course with every gust. And so, the story of Loki endured not as a tale of rise and fall, but as a living reminder that life's greatest strength lies in its ability to adapt, to transform, and to find joy in the unknown. His legacy was not a warning etched in stone, but a whisper in the wind, a glimmer in the eyes of those who dared to question, to explore, and to laugh when the world shifted beneath their feet. In every sunrise that brought unexpected beginnings, in every conversation that sparked a new idea, and in every journey that led somewhere unplanned yet perfect, the spirit of Loki remained a quiet companion to those wise enough to leave room for the twist. As the world continued its quiet dance between order and chaos, the echoes of Loki's influence became so deeply woven into daily life that few even questioned where these customs and beliefs had begun. They simply knew, instinctively, that flexibility was a virtue, that laughter could soften even the harshest truths, and that sometimes the best course was the one no one had considered before. It was a wisdom passed, not through edicts or commandments, but through stories, through experience, and through the subtle understanding that life was never meant to be entirely predictable. In coastal towns where the tides governed the rhythm of existence, fishermen told tales of how the sea itself was a reflection of Loki's spirit. Calm one moment, tempestuous the next, the ocean demanded respect not for its power alone, but for its refusal to be tamed. These sailors learned that survival depended not on fighting the sea's whims, but on learning to move with them. When a sudden storm forced them off course, they did not curse their misfortune. Instead, they watched for new opportunities, knowing that unexpected winds could carry them to richer waters or safer harbors. In the mountain villages, where paths twisted through ancient forests and valleys, travelers marked their journeys with cairn small stacks of stones left at points where the road diverged or where strange things were said to happen. These markers were offerings of sorts, tokens left in recognition that every journey held surprises, and that a safe return often depended on respecting the unseen forces that guided wandering feet. There were stories of those who ignored these customs, those who insisted on following rigid plans without regard for the subtle signs along the way. Their tales were often told as gentle warnings, not of doom, but of missed chances, of travelers who arrived exactly where they intended, only to find that what they sought had already passed them by. The lesson was simple. The path you set out on is rarely the one that leads you to where you truly need to be. Among artisans and craftsmen, imperfections were no longer seen as flaws, but as signs of life within the work. Potters would leave a slight asymmetry in their bowls, weavers a deliberate twist in their patterns. These small deviations were called Loki's mark, honoring the belief that perfection was sterile, while true beauty carried the signature of unpredictability. It was said that these imperfections brought good fortune, inviting creativity and reminding both maker and owner that life's value was found in its uniqueness, not in flawless repetition. Even within relationships, the spirit of the trickster played a role. Couples would celebrate anniversaries not by reaffirming rigid promises, but by sharing stories of how their lives had changed in ways they never expected, how the twists and turns had strengthened their bond, how laughter in uncertain times had drawn them closer. It was understood that love, like life, thrived not in control, but in the shared adventure of navigating the unknown together. In places of learning, teachers encouraged students to question everything not out of defiance, but out of respect for truth. They taught that knowledge was not a fixed thing to be memorized, but a living, evolving understanding shaped by curiosity and the willingness to explore beyond accepted boundaries. Loki's legacy, in this sense, became a beacon for thinkers and innovators, guiding those who dared to imagine a world beyond what was already known. And still, in the quiet corners of the world where stories held power, the old tales of Loki continued to be told not as relics of a bygone era, but as living parables. Around fires, beneath open skies, people spoke of how the trickster had once walked among gods, challenging their pride, exposing their weaknesses, and ultimately ensuring that the world would not remain trapped in unchanging cycles. These tales no longer ended with Loki's binding, or with the fires of Ragnarok, but with the understanding that his story never truly ended at all. It lived on in every act of courage that embraced change, in every clever solution that turned misfortune into fortune, and in every heart that found joy in life's unpredictability. As dusk settled over the land and the first stars began to appear, travelers on winding roads would often pause to listen to the wind in the trees, to the murmur of rivers, to the soft sounds that filled the spaces between certainty and mystery. Those who listened closely swore they could hear it, the faintest echo of laughter, light and fleeting, like a reminder from an old friend that the journey was far from over. And so the world moved forward not in straight lines, but in gentle curves and unexpected turns, guided by the quiet wisdom left behind by a god who refused to be confined by rules or expectations. Loki's presence was no longer something people feared or even consciously invoked. It had become a part of Thema, reflection of the understanding that life's greatest treasures often lay just beyond the edge of the known. In every smile shared after a mistake turned into a blessing, in every bold step taken into uncharted territory, and in every story told to remind the next generation to leave room for surprise, Loki's spirit endured, eternal, ever-changing, and always ready to remind the world that it is in the dance with the unknown where true life begins. With each passing generation, the edges of Loki's story blurred further, not because it was forgotten, but because it had become inseparable from the way people understood the world itself. His tale no longer belonged solely to the myths of gods and ancient battles. It lived in the quiet acceptance that life was a series of shifting patterns, where the unexpected was not a disruption, but a natural part of existence. In distant villages where old customs lingered like morning mist, families still gathered to share stories of how a simple twist of fate had changed their ancestors' lives. A missed opportunity that led to a greater one. A wrong turn that revealed a hidden valley. A loss that opened the door to unforeseen joys. These stories weren't framed as miracles or punishments. They were seen as the gentle work of the unseen hand that nudged those willing to follow, where logic dared not lead. Symbols of Loki, though, never standardized, appeared subtly in everyday life. A spiral etched into a doorway to invite flexibility into the home. A fox carved into walking sticks for travelers seeking guidance on uncertain paths. Or a simple knot tied imperfectly, left undone as a reminder that not everything needed to be finished exactly as planned. These small gestures reflected a quiet respect for the trickster's enduring presence, woven into the rhythms of daily living. In the cities, where progress marched forward with invention and discovery, Loki's influence manifested in the minds of those who refused to accept that tradition was the only path to wisdom. Innovators who questioned long-held beliefs, architects who designed buildings that defied convention, writers who told stories that twisted expectations, all carried within them a spark of that ancient mischief. They didn't invoke Loki's name directly, but they lived by the same principle, that true creation begins when one dares to step beyond the boundaries others fear to cross. Academies and schools began to teach a philosophy rooted in this balance. Young minds were encouraged not only to learn what had been proven, but to explore what had not yet been imagined. Failure was reframed not as a mark of shame, but as an essential step in the dance with uncertainty. Students who found creative solutions to problems, who asked difficult questions, were quietly celebrated as walking in the footsteps of those who understood that wisdom did not always follow a straight line. Throughout the lands, seasonal festivals marked the turning points of the year, not just to honor the cycles of nature, but to embrace the spirit of change itself. These were times when rules were relaxed, when people exchanged roles, when jesters led parades and riddles replaced formal speeches. Masks were worn not to hide, but to reveal the playful truth that identity itself was fluid, that everyone, in their own way, carried a bit of the trickster within. It was during these festivals that children learned some of life's most valuable lessons, not from solemn lectures, but through play. They learned that laughter could ease fear, that flexibility could solve problems, strength could not, and that sometimes the best stories were the ones that didn't go as planned. In this way, Loki's legacy passed quietly from one generation to the next, not imposed, but embraced as a natural part of growing up in a world where change was the only constant. In remote monasteries where philosophers pondered the nature of existence, discussions often circled back to the role of chaos in the grand design. They spoke of Loki not as a deity of disorder, but as the embodiment of potential, the force that ensured the world never became stagnant. They debated whether true harmony was possible without the presence of a force that challenged it, concluding that balance was not a state to be achieved, but a relationship to be nurtured. There were whispers, too, of those rare individuals who claimed to have encountered Loki in his ancient form, but as a traveler, a stranger with a knowing smile and a glint of mischief in his eye. These encounters always followed a pattern. A riddle offered at a crossroads, a piece of advice that seemed absurd at first, but revealed its wisdom in time, a sudden change of direction that led to unexpected fortune. Whether these stories were truth or embellishment mattered little. The lesson remained the same. Be open to the unexpected, for it may carry you toward exactly what you need. As twilight painted the skies with shifting colors, people would often pause to reflect not on what they had controlled, but on the surprises that had shaped their days. A chance meeting, an unforeseen opportunity, a mistake that led to a better outcome. These were the moments that defined their lives far more than any carefully laid plan. And in these reflections, they found comfort not in the illusion of certainty, but in the quiet confidence that they could navigate whatever twists the future held. For they carried with them the wisdom of ages, whispered through stories, etched in symbols, and lived out in every act of adaptability and grace. Thus, Loki's story, once thought to be a tale of rebellion and downfall, revealed its true form, a story without end, a legacy not of chaos, but of transformation. A reminder that life's greatest gifts often arrive wrapped in surprise, waiting for those with the courage to unwrap them. As the centuries unfolded, and the world shaped itself anew with every generation, Loki's presence became something like a quiet pulse beneath the surface of existence. Steady, subtle, but always there. It was no longer necessary to speak his name aloud, for his influence lived in the instincts of those who had learned through experience and story that life was a dance best performed with open hands and a willingness to pivot when the rhythm changed. In every village square, in every city street, people had grown used to the idea that plans were meant to be guides, not chains. A merchant whose shipment was delayed would not curse fate, but would look for new opportunities in the unexpected pause. A craftsman whose work was interrupted by unforeseen events might discover a better design when returning to it later. The understanding was simple but profound when life shifted. It was not always to be resisted. Sometimes, it was an invitation to discover something better than what had been intended. Elders, sitting beneath the shade of old trees, would share stories with younger listeners about how their greatest fortunes had come from paths they hadn't planned to walk. A lost job that led to a lifelong passion, a canceled journey that resulted in meeting a lifelong friend, a simple misstep that revealed a hidden talent. These weren't seen as mere coincidences, but as the subtle work of the ever-present spirit that nudged people toward growth when they least expected it. In the great libraries where scholars debated philosophy and history, it was understood that Loki's legacy wasn't about the grand tales of gods and giants. It was about the quiet lesson that no civilization, no system, and no belief could remain untouched by change. The wisest scholars wrote not of how to control chaos, but of how to listen to it, how to recognize when the winds of transformation were blowing, and how to set sail rather than anchor down in fear. Even in governance, where once rulers tried to enforce strict order, leaders now embraced councils filled with diverse voices, understanding that strength came not from uniformity, but from adaptability. Laws were written with room for interpretation, allowing compassion and creativity to guide justice when rigid rules failed to account for the complexities of real life. It was said that every council chamber kept an empty space, be it a chair, a symbol, or a simple mark upon the wall dedicated to the reminder that the unexpected was always part of the equation. In the arts, Loki's influence thrived. Musicians allowed improvisation to shape their songs. Painters let accidental strokes guide their masterpieces, and writers welcomed stories that twisted away from their original outlines. Creativity flourished when freed from the demand for perfection, and audiences celebrated works that felt alive with spontaneity, pieces that carried within them the spirit of surprise, the echo of a trickster's grin. Children were raised not only to respect tradition but to question it gently, to explore possibilities beyond what they were taught. Schools encouraged curiosity, rewarding those who found new ways to approach old problems. It became common practice for lessons to include moments where students were asked, "What if we did it differently?" A simple question that carried within it the seed of every innovation, every discovery, every leap forward that humanity had ever made. And in the quiet places, the forests where paths curved unexpectedly, the rivers that carved new routes through ancient land, there were still those who left small offerings. A stone placed just so, a carved figure hidden among roots, a whispered word of thanks when fortune smiled in an unforeseen way. These were not acts of worship, but of acknowledgement. A quiet nod to the unseen force that kept life from becoming too predictable, too rigid, too dull. It was said that if you listened closely in these places, especially at dusk or dawn, when the world felt soft and in between, you might hear it the faintest hint of laughter, not cruel, but warm and knowing. A reminder that someone, somewhere, still delighted in the way life could surprise even the most careful planner. Loki's story, once filled with tales of conflict and consequence, had softened into something far more enduring, a legacy, not of rebellion alone, but of resilience, of teaching the world that survival was not about resisting change, but about learning to flow with it, to bend without breaking, to find joy in the detours. As night fell and stars shimmered above, people across the world would reflect on the moments that hadn't gone according to plan, and they would smile. For in those moments, they found the heart of what it meant to live fully, to embrace the uncertainty that made every day a new adventure. And so, Loki remained not as a distant god or a feared trickster, but as a constant companion to all who understood that life's true magic lies in its unpredictability. His was a story without an ending, because as long as the world turned and people dreamed, questioned, and laughed when the unexpected arrived, the spirit of Loki would continue to weave itself through the fabric of existence, eternal, ever-changing, and always just around the next corner. By the time Loki's name had faded from formal histories, and the echoes of gods became little more than stories told under quiet skies, his influence had fully transformed from legend into a living force, subtle, unseen, yet present in every corner of the world where life dared to shift, twist, and grow beyond its boundaries. In bustling towns where innovation thrived, people no longer spoke of chaos with fear. Instead, they spoke of possibility. A merchant whose business took an unexpected turn would say, with a knowing smile, that fortune favored those who left space for surprises. A craftsman, faced with a mistake in his work, would see it not as failure but as an invitation to create something new, something better than originally imagined. It was no longer a question of avoiding disorder, but of understanding that within every disruption lived the seed of transformation. The rhythm of life itself had adjusted to this quiet philosophy. Markets welcomed unpredictability, festivals celebrated spontaneity, and even the most structured institutions had learned to weave flexibility into their foundations. There was an almost instinctive understanding that trying to force the world into a straight line only led to frustration, that true harmony came from learning to dance with the curves. In rural villages where the old ways still held strong, families continued the tradition of telling stories at the end of each day. Though few remembered the details of Ragnarok or the golden halls of Asgard, the heart of Loki's tale endured. It was no longer a saga of gods and giants, but a simple truth passed from one generation to the next, that when life shifts unexpectedly, it is not the end of the road, but the beginning of a new path. Children grew up hearing these lessons wrapped in playful tale stories, where clever heroes triumphed not through strength, but through wit, where problems were solved by looking at them sideways, where laughter turned danger into opportunity. These stories taught them that mistakes were gifts in disguise, that plans were best held lightly, and that curiosity was a compass more reliable than fear. In places where rivers carved ever-changing courses through the land, people built their homes and livelihoods with this same mindset. They didn't fight the shifting waters, they adapted with them, letting the flow guide their way of life. Bridges were built to flex rather than break, homes designed to move when needed. The landscape itself became a reflection of the trickster's quiet guidance, resilient, ever-changing, and beautifully unpredictable. Among scholars and philosophers, Loki's story had become less about a figure from myth and more about a symbol of essential balance. They spoke of him as the embodiment of the moment between what is known and what is possible, the spark that lights when certainty fades and imagination takes hold. Entire schools of thought were built around this principle, teaching that growth begins not in the comfort of answers, but in the courage to ask questions without fearing where they might lead. And so, societies flourished, not by clinging to rigid traditions, but by honoring the past, while welcoming the winds of change. Leaders learned that wisdom came not from imposing order, but from guiding their people through uncertainty with open minds and steady hearts. Communities thrived because they allowed room for creativity, for adaptation, and for the unexpected joys that came when life refused to follow the script. In quiet moments at dawn, when the world felt fresh, or at dusk when shadows stretched, long people would often find themselves reflecting on the strange turns their lives had taken. A chance meeting that altered everything, a failed endeavor that led to unexpected success, a path they never meant to walk, yet couldn't imagine having missed. These reflections were accompanied by a quiet smile, a soft chuckle, and sometimes a whispered thanks to whatever force had nudged them away from the predictable. Though few called him by name anymore, the spirit of Loki was everywhere, in the twists of rivers, in the laughter after a mistake turned into a blessing, in the spark of an idea that appeared when plans fell apart. He had become part of the world's very breath, a constant reminder that life's beauty was not found in perfection, but in the graceful way people learn to move through its surprises. Travelers, especially those who ventured beyond familiar roads, still carried small token stones with unusual shapes, bits of knotted string, or charms carved with symbols only they understood. These weren't talismans for protection, but quiet acknowledgments of the unpredictable paths ahead. It was said that those who embraced these symbols rarely feared getting lost, for they knew that every wrong turn held the promise of discovery. And so, as stars wheeled overhead and the world continued its endless dance of change, Loki's legacy endured not in grand monuments or forgotten temples, but in every heart that welcomed the unknown, in every mind that dared to think differently, and in every soul that found joy not in controlling life, but in experiencing it fully. The Trickster's story had become more than myth. It had become a way of being, soft, eternal whisper, reminding all who listened that when the road bends unexpectedly, it is not a detour, but an invitation to see the world with fresh eyes, to laugh, to adapt, and to trust that sometimes the most beautiful destinations are the ones you never planned to reach. As the years stretched into ages and the world continued to evolve, the lessons born from Loki's legacy became so deeply ingrained in the fabric of life that they no longer needed to be taught explicitly. People moved through their days with an almost instinctive understanding that the unexpected was not an intruder, but a companion, a quiet force that shaped their paths in ways no amount of planning could anticipate. In marketplaces filled with a hum of trade and conversation, a deal that fell through was often met not with frustration, but with a shrug and a smile, as if to say, something better will come. When storms disrupted harvests or journeys were delayed by unforeseen events, communities gathered not to mourn what was lost, but to discover what new opportunities had been revealed in the aftermath. This attitude, that change, was a partner rather than a foe, allowed societies to flourish in ways that rigidity never could. Cities grew not in straight lines, but organically, adapting to the landscape, the weather, and the shifting needs of their people. Roads curved where rivers once ran. Buildings leaned into the wind rather than standing defiantly against it. The very design of civilization reflected the quiet wisdom passed down from a trickster who had once shown the gods that the strongest structures are those that know how to bend. Artists and creators found endless inspiration in this ever-shifting world. They no longer sought perfection, but expression works that captured the fleeting beauty of a moment, knowing that nothing remained the same for long. Musicians composed pieces that changed with each performance, allowing improvisation to guide the melody. Painters left parts of their canvases unfinished, inviting viewers to imagine how the story might continue beyond the frame. In homes, families shared stories not just of past glories or steady traditions, but of the unexpected events that had defined their lives. These were tales of resilience, of laughter found in adversity, of fortunes discovered where none were sought. Children grew up hearing that while it was good to dream and to plan, it was equally important to leave room for life's surprises, to be ready to pivot, to adapt, and to welcome the unknown with open arms. The festivals that marked the turning of seasons became celebrations not only of harvests and time-honored customs, but of unpredictability itself. On certain days, roles were reversed, routines upended, and playful mischief encouraged. People wore mismatched clothes, told stories backwards, and filled the streets with laughter that echoed long into the night. These moments of joyful chaos served as reminders that life was not meant to be too orderly, that spontaneity brought color to existence. In places of learning, students were taught that knowledge was a river, not a well. It flowed, changed course, and carried those who followed it to places they could not predict. Teachers encouraged exploration beyond the textbooks, urging their students to question, to experiment, and to embrace failure as a stepping stone rather than a stumbling block. The brightest minds were those who understood that certainty was often the enemy of discovery. And while the name Loki was rarely spoken in reverence, his essence was felt in every corner of this adaptable world. It was present in the quiet confidence of those who face the unknown without fear, in the clever solutions born from moments when everything seemed to go wrong, in the laughter that followed when people realized that what they thought was a mistake had led them somewhere better than they had planned. In remote regions where the land met the sky in endless horizons, travelers still left tokens at crossroads, small offerings to the spirit of the journey rather than the destination. They believed, as their ancestors had, that the road itself was alive with possibility, and that every unexpected turn was a conversation with the unseen forces that guided them forward. There were whispers, too, of those rare, fleeting encounter stories of strangers met along winding paths, offering riddles or curious advice before vanishing as quickly as they appeared. These tales were told with a wink and a nod, for whether these figures were truly manifestations of the ancient trickster or simply the imagination of wanderers, the lesson remained unchanged. Stay open, stay curious, and never fear when the path ahead twists away from what you expected. As twilight settled over this ever-evolving world, people gathered beneath the stars, sharing stories, songs, and quiet reflections on the strange beauty of their lives. They spoke of how the greatest joys, the most profound connections, and the deepest wisdom had come not from following a straight path, but from embracing the winding roads that life offered. And so, Loki's story continued not as a tale of mischief alone, but as a testament to the resilience and creativity that flourished when people welcomed change rather than resisted it. His legacy lived in every heart that understood the value of adaptability, in every mind that dared to question, and in every soul that found peace not in certainty, but in the adventure of the unknown. Wherever laughter followed a sudden twist of fate, wherever a clever idea turned chaos into opportunity, and wherever someone stood at a crossroads and chose the unexpected path, the spirit of Loki lingered eternal, unseen, but always present in the dance between what is and what could be. As time flowed onward, the world's connection to its ancient stories became less about remembering names and events, and more about living the quiet truths those stories carried. Few could recite the full tale of Loki, the trickster god, who once walked among the Aesir, whose cleverness saved and doomed in equal measure, whose laughter echoed through both triumph and tragedy. Yet, even without the details, people still felt the presence of that old wisdom in the way they approached their lives. In every corner of the world, from quiet hamlets to bustling cities, there remained a shared understanding and almost instinctive reverence for the unexpected. It wasn't superstition, nor was it fear. It was a calm acceptance that life, at its core, was a tapestry woven with threads of unpredictability. And somewhere within that weave, subtle but strong, was the legacy of the one who had taught the world how to bend without breaking. In gardens and fields where farmers worked the land, the rhythm of planting and harvest was guided not only by seasons, but by a respect for nature's whims. A late frost, an early bloom, a sudden storm, these were not curses, but reminders that control was never absolute. The most successful farmers weren't those who fought against change, but those who adapted quickly, who saw opportunity in shifts and surprises. When crops flourished after an unexpected rain, or when a new plant took root where none was sown, it was met with a quiet smile, a nod to the forces beyond human design. In workshops and studios, creators leaned into this same philosophy. The potter welcomed the slight imperfections in clay, knowing they gave each piece its unique soul. The storyteller delighted when a tale took on a life of its own, veering away from its original course to reveal something richer. The inventors celebrated failed experiments, understanding that every misstep carried within it the spark of discovery. Across all forms of creation, there was a shared belief. Perfection was not the absence of flaws, but the ability to find beauty and purpose within them. Communities, too, were shaped by this enduring lesson. Towns were built to flow with the land rather than conquer it, streets winding like rivers, homes designed to shift and grow as families changed. Festivals honored not just the turning of seasons, but the turning points in people's lives, the unexpected events that redefined paths, opened new doors, and led to joys no one could have foreseen. These celebrations weren't grand affairs dictated by tradition, but living, breathing gatherings where spontaneity was encouraged and laughter flowed as freely as the music. In conversations shared beneath starlit skies or beside crackling fires, people spoke less of rigid destinies and more of journeys. They valued stories where heroes stumbled into fortune, where cleverness outshone strength, and where a wrong turn led to the right place. These weren't just tales for entertainment, they were gentle guides, teaching each generation that life's true richness came not from following a straight line, but from embracing every twist and turn along the way. There were those who still whispered of Loki no as a god to be feared or worshipped, but as a spirit that lived within every moment of change. Travelers left offerings at crossroads. Artists carved subtle symbols into their work, and teachers encouraged students to think like the trickster when faced with challenges. It was a quiet, pervasive homage to the force that had once shaken the foundations of gods and, in doing so, taught the world how to move gracefully through uncertainty. Even in the most structured places, courts of law, halls of governance, centers of learning, there was space left for the unpredictable. Decisions were made with flexibility in mind. Rules were written to allow for compassion and creativity, and leaders were chosen not just for their wisdom, but for their ability to adapt when the winds of fate shifted direction. The greatest leaders were those who knew that guiding a people through life's uncertainties required more than strength. It required the humility to laugh when plans unraveled, and the courage to see opportunity where others saw only disruption. And still, in the quiet places, where the wild touched the edges of civilization, there were stories of chance encounters of strangers who offered riddles instead of directions, who appeared when needed and vanished just as quickly. Whether these figures were truly glimpses of Loki or simply the embodiment of his enduring spirit mattered little. What mattered was the lesson they carried, that when faced with a choice, the unexpected path often held the greatest rewards. As the sun rose and set over a world that had learned to breathe with the rhythms of change, people found comfort not in certainty, but in trust. The trust that whatever came their way, they had within them the resilience, the wit, and the grace to navigate it. And in every smile shared after a surprising turn, in every clever solution born from a moment of chaos, and in every heart that welcomed life's mysteries, Loki's story lived on, not as a memory of mischief, but as a testament to the beauty of embracing the unknown. As twilight deepened over a world shaped by countless generations of stories, the essence of Loki lingered not as a figure from the past, but as a quiet presence felt in the way people lived, thought, and adapted. His name, once tied to gods and ancient prophecies, had softened into something more subtle. A whisper in the wind when plans changed, a glimmer of understanding in a shared glance when life took an unexpected turn. In every village square and city street, the rhythms of daily life carried with them an unspoken agreement that the unpredictable was not a force to be feared, but a companion to be welcomed. Markets bustled with trade that shifted like the tides. Artists painted with colors they hadn't planned to use, and travelers set out with destinations in mind, but hearts open to wherever the road might truly lead. It was no longer a conscious invocation of the trickster's legacy, it was simply the way of things. Children learned early that when something didn't go as expected, it wasn't cause for frustration, but for curiosity. A broken toy became parts for a new creation. A rained-out game led to a story shared by the fire. Parents would smile at these moments, knowing that the best lessons were often the ones that arrived unplanned, wrapped in the playful hand of chance. In places where rivers twisted through fertile valleys and forests, whispered with ancient secrets, people built their homes and lives with a respect for nature's unpredictability. Paths were left winding, gardens planted with a mix of wild growth and careful tending. It was understood that control was never absolute, that true harmony came from working with the flow of the world, not against it. And in the heart of every community, there were stories, not just of heroes and distant legends, but of neighbors and family members whose lives had been shaped by unexpected turns. A fisherman who found treasure after being blown off course. A healer who discovered a cure by accident. A friendship born from a chance meeting on a road neither had intended to walk. These were the living echoes of Loki's story, proof that the most meaningful moments often came when the map was forgotten and the journey became its own reward. Among scholars and philosophers, discussions of chaos and order continued not as opposing forces, but as partners in the endless dance of existence. They wrote of Loki not as a symbol of disorder, but as the embodiment of transformation, the necessary spark that kept life from settling into stagnation. Entire philosophies were built around this idea, teaching that wisdom lay not in avoiding change, but in embracing it with grace, humor, and resilience. In distant corners of the world, where the wild still held sway, and the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, travelers spoke of strange encounters. A figure at dusk offering cryptic advice. A sudden shift in the landscape that led to unexpected safety. a riddle carved into stone where no hand should have reached. Whether these were remnants of old magic or simply the world's way of reminding people to stay alert and open-hearted, they were welcomed as signs that the spirit of the trickster was alive and well. Festivals held in the changing seasons celebrated not only the cycles of nature but the surprises that made each year unique. On these days, people traded roles, told stories backward, and filled the streets with playful mischief. It wasn't about chaos for its own sake, but about honoring the truth that life was richer, more vibrant, when one allowed room for the unexpected to weave its patterns through the familiar. As night would fall and fires crackled beneath open skies, elders would remind the young that while strength and wisdom were important, it was often cleverness, adaptability, and a good sense of humor that carried people through life's hardest and most beautiful moments. They would speak softly of the old tales, of the one who had taught gods and mortals alike that to survive was not enough. To truly live, one had to embrace the twists and turns with a light heart and an open mind. And so, Loki's story, once bound by the rise and fall of myth, had become eternal not because it was written in stone, but because it was written in the way people chose to move through the world. In every decision to laugh instead of lament, in every step taken down an uncertain path, and in every heart that found joy in the mystery of what came next, the trickster's legacy thrived. Wherever a sudden change led to unexpected fortune, wherever a clever thought turned trouble into triumph, wherever someone stood at a crossroads and chose curiosity over fear, Loki was there not as a shadow of the past, but as a living spark in the present. For as long as the world turned and people dreamed beyond the limits of what they knew, there would always be a place for the spirit of mischief, for the guide who whispered that life's greatest treasures are often hidden in the places we never meant to go. Long after the gods had faded into stardust, and the stories of Asgard lived only in the quiet spaces of memory and firelight, Loki's presence endured not in form, not in name, but in the rhythm of how the world breathed. His essence had become something deeper than legend, a pattern that hummed in the background of every unexpected turn, every sudden revelation, every twist of fate that broke the ordinary and made way for something new. In lands that had once been ruled by kings and sages, people moved forward not with blind certainty, but with an openness to whatever the next moment might bring. They had come to understand that clinging too tightly to what is known left little room for what could be, and so plans were made with space left around the edges. A flexibility not born of laziness, but of wisdom, an understanding passed quietly from elder to child, from story to soul. Small rituals remained in their daily lives. At sunrise, when the first light touched the earth, people would pause just for a breath to listen, not for voices, not for prophecy, but for that soft, internal sense that the day ahead would not unfold entirely as expected, and that this was not something to fear. At crossroads, travelers often turned a full circle before choosing a direction, a gesture said to honor the unpredictable spirit of the road. Not all turned the same way, but each one turned with the same awareness that every step carried within it the seed of the unknown. Art continued to be the purest reflection of Loki's legacy. Poets wrote lines that refused to rhyme but sang in the mind. Musicians played notes that broke the rules and stirred emotions deeper than any perfect harmony could reach. Dancers moved with spontaneous grace, each performance a living, breathing conversation between the moment and the self. These creations weren't praised for their perfection, but for their soul. for the way they made space for something unplanned to emerge and touch the hearts of those who witnessed them. In education, young minds were taught the old truths with new language. Lessons weren't just about knowledge, but about perception. Not about right answers alone, but about the courage to ask questions no one else had thought to ask. Children learned early that when things went wrong, when drawings smudged or answers failed, it was not an ending, but the beginning of discovery. Teachers spoke often of the value of the turn, that sudden shift when a moment changes direction and opens a path no one saw coming. And each time it happened, they smiled, for they knew they were watching a bit of magic unfold. In relationships too, the trickster's wisdom endured. Partners learned not just to weather change together, but to welcome it, to grow with it. Friendships deepened not because they were always easy, but because they were resilientable to laugh at missteps, to forgive the unforeseen, and to reinvent themselves when needed. People learned to hold one another, not with the desperation of certainty, but with the joy of shared exploration. Together, they understood that love was not static, but alive, like a flame that danced in the shifting winds of time. In sacred, space-quiet gardens, hollowed groves, dim-lit rooms where people sought understanding, there remained a place for the mystery. It was not named, not defined, but it was acknowledged in silence. Here, people offered thanks not just for what they had, but for what they did not yet know. For the unseen hand that had nudged them forward when they thought they were lost. For the twist that turned pain into insight. For the sudden shift that led them to exactly where they needed to be. There were still those who claimed, from time to time, to see a figure at the edge of the forest path or seated beside a fire that had just been kindled, not threatening, not divine, just watching. Some said he wore a cloak of many colors. Others that his eyes held a kind of ancient mischief. He never stayed long. He offered riddles or left behind something strange, a feather where no bird had flown, a stone warm in the snow. Whether he was real or imagined mattered little. The world had long since learned that meaning does not need proof to be true. And so the story continued, not in books alone, not in the carvings of stone or the scrolls of old, but in the living, breathing choices of people who had inherited something they could not always name. A way of moving through the world, of dancing with what came instead of mourning what didn't, of understanding that the true magic of life often blooms from its chaos. Loki, once a god bound in chains, once the harbinger of the world's end, had become something more lasting than either punishment or prophecy. He had become the spark in the eye of the storm, the smile at the edge of surprise, the voice that whispered, not loudly, but clearly enough to hear, when all else fell silent. You didn't expect that, did you? And with that whisper, the world would shift again. In a world where centuries blended softly into one another, where the great upheavals of gods and giants were little more than faint echoes beneath the hum of daily life, the legacy of Loki had become less a story told and more a way of seeing. It was in the quiet moments between thought and action, between expectation and surprise, that people still felt the brush of something ancient and playful, something that reminded them that certainty was never the point. The rivers still carved new paths when least expected. The winds still shifted without warning, and the stars themselves, though seemingly fixed, told stories that changed depending on who was watching and when. Nature had always known the secret that people had to learn, that movement, transformation, and unpredictability were not flaws in the design, but the design itself. In every corner of this world, People had woven that understanding into the rhythm of their lives. Cities, though grand and carefully built, were designed with change in mind walls that could expand, streets that could twist to follow new needs. Villages adapted with the seasons, not just in work but in mindset. No one was surprised when plans needed to bend. In fact, there was a quiet pride in how gracefully they could do so. At the heart of every community, gatherings still took place beneath open skies or within warmly lit halls, where stories were shared not as rigid lessons, but as invitations to think, to wonder, to laugh at the strange ways life unfolded. The oldest among them would smile as they listened to younger voices recount tales of unexpected fortunes or misadventures turned into blessings. They had heard these stories before, not these exact ones, but versions of them repeated through time like a melody that never grew old. Among travelers and explorers, there remained a tradition of stepping off the known path, not out of recklessness, but out of trust that the world still had secrets to offer those willing to stray. Maps were drawn, yes, but they were drawn lightly, always with the understanding that the land might choose to reveal something different tomorrow. A detour was never just a delay, it was a door to discovery. Artists continued to honor the spirit of the unpredictable in every brushstroke, every note played, every word written. Masterpieces were celebrated not for their precision, but for the life within them, the parts that surprised even their creators. It was said that if a work of art turned out exactly as planned, it was missing the touch of the trickster, that spark of the unexpected that made it truly alive. In conversations over meals, or during long walks through fields and forests, people spoke easily of how their lives had been shaped by moments they hadn't anticipated. A wrong turn that led to a lifelong friendship, a failure that opened the door to a calling they never imagined, a simple twist of fate that changed everything for the better. These stories weren't seen as rare, they were understood as the natural flow of existence when one walked with openness and curiosity. Even in matters of governance and law, the wisdom of leaving room for change prevailed. Decisions were made with flexibility, knowing that what served today might not fit tomorrow. Councils were guided not just by tradition, but by those who could see beyond it, those who carried within them a playful understanding that sometimes the best solutions came from turning a problem upside down and seeing it from a new angle. And in the quiet spaces and mountain tops where clouds kissed the earth, by rivers that sang to the stones, beneath trees older than memory, there were still those who left small signs of gratitude. A token placed where paths crossed, a carved spiral hidden among roots, a whispered word to the wind. Not out of superstition, but out of respect for the unseen companion who walked beside anyone brave enough to welcome the unknown. It was said that on certain nights, when the moon hung low and the world seemed to hold its breath, you might catch a glimpse of movement just beyond the corner of your eye. A flicker of color, a shadow that didn't quite belong. If you followed, you wouldn't find danger, only a deeper understanding of yourself. A reminder that the journey was never really about the destination. And so, the essence of Loki lived on not as a figure to be summoned or a myth to be recited, but as a quiet force that shaped the way people approached life itself. His story was written in every moment, where someone chose to laugh instead of lament, to adapt instead of resist, to see opportunity where others saw only disruption. In every unexpected joy, in every twist of fate that led to something beautiful, the world remembered not with fear, but with a knowing smile that the trickster was still at play. Not to cause harm, but to remind all who listened that life's true magic lies in its unpredictability. And somewhere, carried on the wind, was the faintest echo of laughter, eternal, gentle, and forever inviting those who heard it to dance with the unknown. In a world that had long since forgotten the sharp lines between myth and reality, where gods were no longer figures of fear or reverence, but quiet threads woven into the way people lived, Loki's story continued not in words alone, but in the choices made each day. His presence had softened over the ages, not diminished, but transformed. From a name spoken with caution to a spirit felt in every corner where life refused to be predictable. There was no temple to Loki, no grand statue carved in his likeness. His legacy didn't need stone or song to endure. It thrived in the subtle moments, the misstep that led to a better path, the failed plan that revealed a hidden opportunity, the laughter that followed when something unexpected turned out to be exactly what was needed. Children, growing up under skies filled with shifting clouds and winds that carried whispers of old stories, learned early that the world was not a place to be controlled, but to be explored. They were taught to greet surprises not with fear, but with curiosity, to see every twist in their day as a question worth answering. When a game changed its rules halfway through, when a project took an unexpected turn, they didn't complain. They adapted, smiled, and found joy in the new shape of things. In villages, nestled between forests and rivers, people still practiced small rituals that honored the unpredictable. Before planting seeds, they'd scatter a few beyond the tilled soil, trusting that nature and perhaps something more playful might choose to grow them in places no hand had intended. When setting out on journeys, travelers would leave a stone unturned at their doorstep, a simple gesture to invite fortune to guide them beyond their expectations. Among storytellers, Loki's tale was no longer confined to ancient battles or trickery among gods. Instead, it had become a living metaphor, a reminder shared in countless forms that life's beauty often revealed itself in the places where plans unraveled. Tales were told of clever villagers who solved problems by embracing chaos, of wanderers who found their purpose only after losing their way, of lovers whose paths crossed by chance when both were headed elsewhere. Artists continued to celebrate this spirit in their creations, paintings that shifted in meaning depending on where one stood, songs that invited the listener to add their own melody, sculptures designed to break apart and be rearranged. These works weren't about perfection, but about participation, a dance between creator, creation, and the unknown. It was said that true art left space for surprise, and in that space, the essence of Loki could always be found. In the bustling heart of cities, merchants and inventors thrived by thinking like the trickster. Markets weren't just places of trade, but arenas of playful negotiation, where wit was valued as highly as coin. Innovations often came from accidents, and the most celebrated minds were those who knew how to turn a mistake into a masterpiece. Failure was never final, it was simply the first step toward discovering something unexpected, and often better. And in moments of quiet reflection, when the day's work was done and the world settled into the soft hum of evening, people would think back on the twists their lives had taken. Rarely did they walk the path they had once imagined, but few regretted it. They knew, deep down, that the detours had shaped them more than any destination could have. It was in those unplanned turns where they had grown, laughed, loved, and truly lived. There were still stories whispered of fleeting encounters, a stranger at a crossroads offering odd advice, a sudden shift in the wind that carried a voice too soft to understand but clear enough to feel. These tales weren't told with fear, but with fondness. Whether it was Loki himself or simply the world's way of reminding them to stay open, people cherished these moments as signs that they were not alone in navigating life's winding paths. In the highest places, where clouds brushed mountaintops, and in the deepest forests where sunlight played tricks through the leaves, it was said that the spirit of mischief lingered strongest. Those who ventured there didn't seek to conquer nature, they sought to listen, to feel the pulse of a world that thrived on change. And if they returned with a new perspective, a story of something unexpected and wonderful, it was quietly understood that they had walked for a time with the old trickster himself. And so, the world continued not as a place of rigid order, but as a canvas constantly repainted by the brushstrokes of chance, choice, and change. Loki's story was no longer about rise or fall. It was about flow, a gentle current beneath every decision to embrace the unknown, every laugh shared when things didn't go as planned, every step taken into a future that no one could fully predict. For as long as hearts remained open to wonder, as long as minds welcomed new ways of thinking, and as long as people found joy in the dance with the unexpected, Loki's presence would endure not as a shadow of chaos, but as the quiet, eternal guide reminding all who listened that life's true path is never straight, and that's exactly where its magic lies. As the seasons turned and generations passed, like leaves carried on a gentle wind, the world became a place where the unexpected was no longer seen as disruption, but as the quiet heartbeat of life itself. In this world, Loki's story, though rarely spoken in full, had settled into the roots of everyday wisdom, an ever-present reminder that the most beautiful moments often arrived unannounced. In quiet villages where the sunrise painted golden light across rolling hills, people began each day with a sense of openness. Plans were made, of course, but never with the illusion that they were set in stone. When the rain came early or the market closed unexpectedly, there was no panic, only a calm acceptance that life was offering a different rhythm, a chance to dance to a tune they hadn't heard before. Children played games without strict rules, delighting in how easily a simple contest could transform into a new adventure when someone changed the course mid-step. It was in these playful shifts that they first learned the deeper lesson that flexibility wasn't just a way to cope, but a way to thrive. Laughter followed every unexpected turn, and in those echoes, the ancient spirit of the trickster smiled. In towns where artisans and merchants filled cobbled streets with color and sound, creativity flourished because it was allowed to wander. A weaver might set out to craft a pattern passed down through generations, only to discover a new design when the thread tangled unexpectedly. A baker might stumble upon a beloved recipe by mistaking one ingredient for another. These small surprises became stories of pride, shared as proof that fortune often favored those who welcomed imperfection. Even in the places where order was most valued, in councils and courts, in schools and gatherings, there was an understanding that wisdom required room to breathe. Debates welcomed unconventional ideas, and leaders were chosen not only for their knowledge but for their ability to adapt when faced with the unknown. It was said that the best decisions were those made with one eye on tradition and the other on possibility. Throughout the land, festivals marked not just the predictable cycles of harvest and solstice, but the unpredictable joys of chance. These celebrations were filled with games of riddles, playful tricks, and sudden shifts in roles where leaders served meals and children gave speeches. Masks were worn to remind everyone that identity, like life itself, could change in a moment, and that behind every mask was the freedom to explore a different side of oneself. Travelers still left small offerings at the edges of forests, and beside winding river tokens to honor the journey more than the destination. A feather placed on a stone, a coin left where paths crossed, a ribbon tied to a tree branch swaying in the breeze. These gestures weren't born of fear or superstition, but of gratitude for the unseen guidance that came when the road twisted away from expectation and revealed something far greater than any map could promise. There were quiet tales, too, of those who returned from such journeys with stories that felt touched by something otherworldly, a voice that suggested a different path when danger lay ahead, a figure glimpsed only for a heartbeat, offering a smile that seemed to know far more than it should. These stories were told softly, with a sense of wonder rather than disbelief. Whether they were dreams, fate, or the lingering presence of a long-forgotten god, it mattered little. What mattered was the reminder that no one truly walked alone when they embraced the unknown. In homes warmed by firelight, elders would speak of how their lives had been shaped not by the plans they made, but by the moments when those plans fell apart. Though every detour had led them to unexpected friendships, unforeseen joys, and lessons they never would have sought but were grateful to have learned. They would end these stories with a familiar phrase, passed down through time: "The straight road is for those in a hurry, but the winding path holds the better view." And so Loki's story lived on, not in grand retellings of his deeds among the gods, but in the quiet, daily acts of those who carried his legacy in their hearts. It was found in every clever solution to a sudden problem, in every burst of laughter after a surprising turn, in every soul who chose curiosity over fear when life shifted beneath their feet. The world had learned, through countless generations, that to resist change was to miss the point of living. Instead, they moved with it gracefully, playfully, and with the confidence that whatever came next, they would find a way to turn it into something beautiful. And somewhere beyond the edges of certainty, where the horizon always promised something new, the spirit of the trickster watched not as a distant god, but as a companion to every traveler of life's unpredictable roads. His laughter, soft and knowing, echoed in every corner where joy met surprise, where courage met curiosity, and where people remembered that the best parts of any story are the ones no one sees coming. As the days folded gently into years, and the years into centuries, the presence of Loki became something like the wind unseen but always felt, moving through the lives of those who had long since stopped thinking of him as a distant figure from forgotten myths. His story was no longer recounted in full, for it had become too deeply woven into the very way people understood the world. It wasn't a tale with a beginning, middle, and end. It was a quiet understanding that life itself was shaped by the dance between what is known and what can never be predicted. In fields where farmers worked alongside the rhythms of nature, they no longer cursed the sudden storm or the shifting seasons. Instead, they adapted with a smile, knowing that the land was alive with its own kind of wisdom that could not be tamed by calendars or charts. When unexpected bounty appeared where none was expected, or when a failed crop led to a discovery of richer soil elsewhere, they would nod in quiet acknowledgement of the unseen force that guided those willing to bend. In workshops filled with the scent of wood, metal, and ink, creators embraced the unexpected as a partner in their craft. A crack in the grain of timber might inspire a new design. A spilled pigment could become the heart of a painting. These accidents were not setbacks, but invitation reminders that beauty often emerged from moments beyond control. Apprentices were taught not just the skills of their trade, but the art of letting go when the work began to take on a life of its own. Communities held fast to their traditions, But those traditions had evolved not as rigid rules, but as living customs that encouraged flexibility and play. Festivals remained vibrant celebrations of unpredictability, where fortunes could change with the toss of a coin, and where laughter echoed through streets lit by lanterns swaying in the wind. People wore mismatched clothes, told stories that twisted in unexpected directions, and shared meals where the ingredients were chosen by chance rather than recipe. In the heart of every home, stories were still told not of gods and giants, but of everyday moments when life surprised its inhabitants. A letter arriving at just the right time. A meeting that seemed accidental, but proved to be fate. A mistake that led to a joy no one had planned. These stories, passed from parent to child, became lessons in resilience, curiosity, and the quiet magic of embracing what could not be foreseen. Among scholars and thinkers, the philosophy of balance between order and unpredictability shaped how societies grew. No law was written without space for compassion and adjustment. No plan was set in motion without the understanding that it might change, and that change could be a gift. The wisest leaders were those who listened not only to advisors and traditions, but to the subtle shifts in the world around them, the signs that it was time to pivot, to rethink, to welcome a new direction. Travelers continued to honor the old ways, leaving small tokens at crossroads or whispering words to the wind before setting out on unfamiliar paths. They knew that the journey was never just about reaching a destination, but about the discoveries made when the road twisted unexpectedly. Stories of strange encounters of riddles offered by strangers, of sudden changes in weather that revealed hidden paths were cherished as proof that the world was still alive with mystery. And in the quiet moments, those spaces between heartbeats, when the world seemed to hold its breath, people felt it. That subtle nudge, that playful whisper in the back of the mind suggesting a different way, a new idea, a reason to laugh when things didn't go as planned. They didn't call it by name, but they recognized it all the same, the enduring presence of a spirit that had taught the world long ago that chaos was not destruction, but transformation. Loki's story, once filled with grand gestures and divine conflicts, had become something far more intimate and lasting. It was written in the way people chose to live with openness, with adaptability, and with the quiet confidence that no matter how the winds of fate shifted, they could find their way by moving with them rather than against them. As the stars traced their endless paths across the night sky, reflecting the ever-changing nature of existence, people would look up and smile and nod, because they understood every pattern, but because they had learned to find comfort in the unknown. They knew that within every unanswered question, every unexpected turn, there was the promise of something new, something alive. And so, the spirit of the trickster endured, not bound to stories of old, but alive in every choice to embrace change, in every laugh shared when life surprised them, and in every step taken down a path that led somewhere wonderful, precisely because it was never planned. As the world moved forward in its quiet, unhurried way, the traces of Loki's legacy became as natural as the changing of the seasons, or the shifting winds that carried stories from one village to the next. No one questioned when life took an unexpected turn. It was simply understood that this was how things were meant to be. The rhythm of existence had learned to hum in tune with unpredictability, and people found comfort not in control, but in the graceful art of adaptation. In towns where the streets curved like rivers and buildings leaned into the contours of the land, architects no longer designed with rigid lines and strict order. Instead, they crafted spaces that invited movement, that welcomed light where shadows once fell, and that shifted with the needs of those who lived within them. Homes were built with doors that opened to unexpected views, windows that framed the sky differently each season. It was said that a house without surprises was a house without life. Across the countryside, farmers planted diverse fields, never expecting each harvest to mirror the last. They spoke of listening to the land, a practice that valued intuition as much as tradition. When a new plant took root where none had been sown, it was welcomed as a gift, a sign that nature, like fate, had its own ideas. These small miracles were met with quiet gratitude, a nod to the unseen forces that guided those who trusted the flow rather than fought against it. In marketplaces filled with color, sound, and the scent of fresh bread and spices, merchants thrived not because they predicted every change, but because they embraced it. A missing shipment led to a new partnership. A sudden storm brought travelers who became loyal customers. Deals were struck with laughter and a shared understanding that fortune favored those who could see opportunity hiding within disruption. Storytellers no longer needed to invoke Loki's name to share his wisdom. The tales they told were woven with themes of cleverness, resilience, and the quiet power of letting go when the world shifted. Heroes were not those who forced their will upon fate, but those who danced with it, who found joy in the unexpected, and who understood that true strength lay in flexibility, not rigidity. Children grew up surrounded by these stories and the living examples of their lessons. They were encouraged to explore, to question, to play with ideas as much as with toys. When they stumbled, they were taught to look for what new path had opened before them, rather than dwell on the one that had closed. Schools celebrated creativity over conformity, rewarding those who could turn a problem sideways and find solutions no one else had imagined. In places of governance, leaders held council not to enforce unyielding rules, but to guide their communities through the ever-changing tides of life. Policies were written with the understanding that tomorrow might require a different answer than today. The greatest leaders were those who could laugh when plans unraveled and who inspired their people to see every challenge as a doorway rather than a wall. Throughout it all, small traditions endured those quiet acknowledgments of the unpredictable spirit that shaped their world. A coin tossed into a fountain with a wish not for certainty, but for adventure. A piece of ribbon tied to a tree branch to mark a turning point in a journey. A moment of silence before setting out on a new endeavor, inviting the unknown to walk alongside. There were still whispered tales of wanderers meeting a figure at dusk, offering riddles or playful advice before disappearing down a path no one else could see. Whether these stories were born of imagination or something more, they were cherished as reminders that the world still held mysteries and that those mysteries were not to be solved, but embraced. As night settled over fields and forests, cities and seas, people would look to the stars not seeking answers, but marveling at the endless expanse of possibilities. They knew that the constellations told stories, but that those stories could shift depending on how one chose to see them. It was a comfort, knowing that even the sky above honored the spirit of change. And so, Loki's presence remained not as a shadow lurking in the corners, but as a quiet companion in every moment where life refused to follow a script. His story was not bound to the past, but alive in every choice to smile when plans went astray, in every step taken into the unknown, with curiosity rather than fear. For those who understood, every day carried the echo of his laughter, not loud or mocking, but soft and knowing. A reminder that life's greatest treasures were rarely found where one expected, and that the most beautiful journeys were those shaped by the winds of chance. In this world, shaped by acceptance, resilience, and a playful embrace of uncertainty, Loki's tale was eternal not because it was told, but because it was lived. In the quiet moments when dawn met the horizon and the world stirred gently awake, there was a sense felt more than understood that life itself was a story still being written. No one knew exactly where each path would lead, but few worried about that anymore. The people of this world had learned, through generations of experience and quiet wisdom, that the beauty of existence was not in its predictability, but in its endless capacity to surprise. Loki's legacy had long since transcended the boundaries of myth and memory. It no longer belonged to the past, nor was it confined to stories told by firelight. It lived in the air, in the way people approached each day with openness, in the way they laughed when fate shifted their plans, and in the quiet confidence they carried when walking roads that twisted away from expectation. There were no monuments to the trickster, God none were needed. His presence was etched in the way rivers meandered through the land, how forests grew in patterns that defied straight lines, how winds changed direction without warning. Nature itself seemed to honor the spirit of unpredictability, reminding all who paid attention that the world was alive with possibility. In villages, towns, and cities, people moved through life with a graceful acceptance of the unknown. When challenges arose, they met them not with fear, but with curiosity. When fortunes changed, they adapted, trusting that every ending carried within it the seed of a new beginning. This was not naivety, but a deep understanding that resilience was born from flexibility, and that joy could often be found in the most unexpected places. Children grew up learning that questions were more valuable than answers set in stone. They were encouraged to explore, to experiment, to welcome mistakes as stepping stones toward discovery. In their laughter, in their games that changed rules as they played, the essence of the trickster thrived, teaching them early that life was meant to be danced with, not controlled. Artists continued to find inspiration in the unpredictable. Their works were celebrations of spontaneity, songs that shifted with each performance, paintings that invited viewers to see something different each time they looked, stories that twisted away from familiar endings. Creativity was no longer about mastery over form, but about partnership with the unknown. In places of learning and governance, the wisdom of leaving space for change guided decisions both great and small. Leaders understood that strength lay not in rigid control, but in the ability to guide communities through the ever-changing tides of existence. Laws were written with kindness, with flexibility, always allowing for the unique circumstances that life inevitably presented. And still, in the quiet corners of the world, on mountain paths, beside winding rivers, beneath the shifting canopy of ancient forests, there were those who felt closest to the old spirit. Travelers left simple offerings, not out of obligation, but as gestures of gratitude for the unseen hand that turned detours into destinations. They understood that every step into the unknown was a conversation with the forces that shaped the world, not through power, but through playful, gentle guidance. There were whispers, always whispers, of those who had encountered something, a presence, a figure, a voice carried on the wind, a suggestion to take a different path, a riddle that made sense only after the journey was done, a glimmer of mischief in a stranger's eyes before they vanished from sight. These stories were never told with fear. They were shared with smiles, as reminders that the trickster still walked beside those willing to embrace life's uncertainties. As night fell and stars stretched across the sky like a map of endless possibilities, people would look upward, not seeking destiny, but marveling at the vastness of what could be. They knew that their lives, like the constellations, were part of a pattern that shifted depending on how they chose to see it. And so, the story of Loki Trickster, the catalyst, the eternal companion of change, continued without need for an ending. It lived in every choice to laugh when things went awry, in every clever solution found when the expected path disappeared, in every heart that welcomed the unknown not as a threat, but as a friend. For as long as there were questions left to ask, as long as rivers chose their own course, as long as people dared to step beyond the familiar with a spark of curiosity and a willingness to be surprised, Loki's spirit would endure not as a relic of the past, but as the quiet, playful reminder that life's greatest magic lies not in knowing what comes next, but in embracing the wonder of discovering it. And somewhere, carried softly on the breeze that rustles through leaves and whispers through open windows, there would always be that faint echo of laughter, timeless, gentle, and forever inviting those who hear it to dance with the unexpected. And so, the story of Loki does not truly end. For in every twist of fate, in every unexpected turn, his spirit lives on, quiet, playful, and eternal. A reminder that life's greatest moments often come when we let go of certainty and welcome the unknown with a smile. Thank you for joining me on this journey through myth, mystery, and the gentle wisdom of the trickster. May your dreams be filled with curiosity, and may you always find joy in life's beautiful surprises. Good night.